They came at dawn, as the mountains began to stir with first light. Even the thin wind that howled through the heights sounded like it carried the echoes of something momentous. For generations, the Vale had stood aloof from the troubles of the realm, shielded by sheer peaks and narrow passes. Yet on this day the mountains trembled. At Robb Stark's command, the armies of the north advanced upon the Bloody Gate, that forbidding fortress of stone and ice that had barred innumerable invaders. At his side, tall in the saddle, rode Jon Snow, the black of the Night's Watch cloak left behind in the days long past, replaced now by a simple, rugged cloak of gray. It was a symbol of the changed times. Jon, a Stark in all but name, following his brother, his king, into the Vale itself. Little-footed couriers swept before the northern host, seeking parley, or at least demanding answers. The realm was ablaze with rumors. No one had believed the boy king in the north could gather enough men after all the betrayals, let alone march them through the treacherous roads. But the north had proven resilient, heartbreak forging a sharper blade than ever. Winterfell had been recaptured from turncoats. The traitors had paid their due. And though the Iron Throne might sneer at the notion of a northern king, Robb had notched victory after victory against men far older and more cunning than he. Now, with the north behind him and the riverlands subdued, Robb turned his attention east. Why the Vale? Some said it was to protect Sansa Stark. Others whispered that Robb wanted to punish Petyr Baelish, Lord Protector of the Vale, for some clandestine betrayal. Still others believed the strategic vantage of the Vale was too ripe to ignore. If the airy bent the knee, it would mean an unassailable ally for the north. Perhaps all the rumors held a grain of truth. Perhaps the impetus was simpler. The Vale, under Baelish's sly governance, had shut its gates to the War of the Five Kings, only to open them when they stood to profit. Now, with petty strife still simmering, Petyr Baelish had begun to weave new intrigues that threatened the fragile hold Robb had carved out for the north. It was no small feat to traverse the Vale's border. Winter winds had begun to prowl the high roads. Nightfall came quickly, trailing in the belly of those jagged mountains. But the Northmen were used to cold, to sparse rations and harsh roads. They marched with grim stoicism. Every day, Jon rose at dawn to help see to the men's needs, caring for the wounded, ensuring rations were fair. In quieter moments, he would ride beside Robb, where they spoke in hushed tones of strategy and hope of the North's future. Jon, who had once worn black, who had once pledged his life to guard the realms of men, had found himself drawn fully into his brother's cause. Winterfell had always been his home, even if circumstances had denied him the Stark name. Yet now, in the heart of a new war, his loyalty was as unwavering as any true-born son. They approached the Bloody Gate not with catapults or siege towers, but with a confidence that unnerved the men behind the walls. For nearly half a fortnight, they stood arrayed, sending heralds who requested entry in the name of King Robb Stark, demanding an audience with the Lords of the Vale. Petyr Baelish's hold was no longer a minor rumor. Robb had gleaned from travelers, from ravens, that Baelish had consolidated power, putting the boy Lord Robert Arryn in a decorative cage of sorts. The child lord was said to be ill, coddled, and under the complete thrall of Baelish. The Knights of the Vale, fractious though they often were, still took pride in their traditions. Yet somehow Baelish had them dancing to his tune, except for those who had begun to grow suspicious. And for that, Baelish needed more cunning, or a strong external alliance. The message was simple. The king in the north sought to treat with the Vale. If refused, they would take what they needed by right of conquest. The Vale's neutrality could no longer be tolerated. And so, with each passing day of inaction from within, Robb's outriders scouted the passes. Jon led them on occasion, quietly impressed by the sheer immensity of the mountain terrain. He remembered hearing tales of his Aunt Lisa Arryn's hospitality and the near-impenetrable nature of the airy. Once, so it was said, even the famed Targaryen dragons found the Vale's peaks a challenge to navigate. Yet Robb's men, spurred on by the memory of betrayal and the knowledge that the entire realm seemed to teeter on the brink of chaos, waited with a fierce patience. At last, a flutter of banners appeared atop the Bloody Gate. A trumpet call resounded off stone walls, echoing down the ravine. The gate creaked open just enough to allow a small retinue to emerge. At their head rode Ser Brynden Tully, the Blackfish. He had been in the Vale for some time, attempting to unravel Baelish's hold, but had apparently found himself stymied by the cunning manipulator. His face, sharp and grim, brightened at the sight of Robb's direwolf banner. They embraced as uncle and nephew, the winter chill melting for a moment in that familial bond. Next to him rode a Vale knight clad in plate, face uncertain beneath a swan-crested helm. The man introduced himself as Ser Royce in a shaky voice. He looked upon the northern camp with wary eyes, perhaps glimpsing the thousands of battle-hardened soldiers arrayed in rows. The Vale was not used to such large gatherings of armed men at its gates. Brynden wasted no time. "Peter Baelish is uncertain how to receive you," he said in a low tone, mindful of the Vale knights close by. "He'd prefer you remain outside and send a small delegation in. He claims the Airy is no place for an entire northern host." Robb, tall in the saddle, gazed up at the high walls. Grey Wind, his great direwolf, prowled at the foot of his horse, teeth bared. The men who spotted the beast flinched, for the direwolf seemed an omen of the North's vengeance. Robb spoke with that cool authority that had grown over his campaigns. "He offers hollow courtesies. He knows I won't march my host into these mountains blindly. Every pass can be an ambush, and if I come with a mere handful of men, I could find myself thrown from the Airy's moon door." Ser Royce stiffened. Lord Baelish would never, but Brynden raised a hand, silencing the Vale knight. "My king, I've done what I can to muster support among the lesser lords. Young Lord Robert is guarded night and day by Baelish's men. The child's health is frail, and those who once might have stood for Arryn independence are scattered or cowed. Baelish has the key to the Airy's treasury. He has the hearts of too many, but more than that, he has Sansa Stark." The Blackfish let the name hang in the air. Jon felt his heart tighten at that. He knew Sansa was in the Vale, had known for some time, but hearing her name uttered in such a dire tone made the chill of the wind feel sharper. He thought of that long-ago day, the last time he saw her at Winterfell, bright-eyed and dreaming of courtly life. Now she was a pawn for Baelish's advantage, presumably betrothed or half-betrothed to someone, or used as a figurehead. Everyone knew Sansa was the elder daughter of the late Ned Stark, the true warden of the North. If Robb died without an heir, if something befell the line of succession, Sansa might hold the keys to Winterfell in the eyes of certain southern lords. Baelish would never let such advantage slip through his fingers willingly. Robb's expression hardened. "Sansa is not a bargaining chip. I mean to free her if she's being kept. The Vale must choose its allegiance. If Lord Baelish refuses to heed my summons, I'll take the Airy by force." His voice held no boast, only resolve. The Vale Knight opened his mouth to protest, but the Blackfish silenced him again with a look. Over the next few days, uneasy negotiations began. Ravens were exchanged. Baelish's messages were couched in courtesy, promising open arms, but only if Robb would leave his soldiers in the valley. Robb refused. He remembered well how the phrase guest right had once been twisted to produce the Red Wedding, an infamous betrayal that nearly ended House Stark's line. No, he would not walk blindly into an enclosed fortress, not after all that had happened. Meanwhile, the tension in camp crackled like static before a storm. Men readied their armor, sharpened their swords. The Vale Knights arrayed themselves behind the bloody gate, prepared for a siege or a forced entry. Jon remained close to Robb's side throughout. On the seventh night, Robb called a council of his most trusted advisors. Lords Manderly, Bolton, this time Roos's son, Dom Eric, a quieter and more thoughtful man than his late father, Lord Serwyn, and the great Jon had all gathered, along with Brynden Tully, who had been granted leave to move freely by the Vale's tenuous leadership. They huddled in Robb's pavilion, candlelight throwing flickering shadows on the walls. The question was simple: how to breach the Vale. Or, rather, how to remove Peter Baelish's hold without shedding needless blood. "The Knights of the Vale have seldom endured a true war on their own soil," said Dom Eric Bolton quietly. "We could starve them out. If we blockade the roads, they'll run out of resources." Brynden shook his head. "That may take months. And we risk letting Baelish weave a cunning escape. We need a decisive strike at the Airy. That's the seat of their power. But the path there is narrow, easily defensible." Lords Manderly and Serwyn muttered about the losses to morale such a siege would bring. The great Jon roared that he would personally march up the mountain paths and tear down the Ares gates, an image so outlandish given the fortress's position that even he laughed. But amid the jests, a certain resignation settled upon them all. The Vale would not be taken easily. Yet every day Baelish held Sansa, and every day the Vale remained outside the northern cause, was another day that gave King's Landing, the Lannisters, or any other enemy the chance to pivot and strike. Jon listened, arms crossed over his chest. When the voices had subsided, he spoke in a quiet, measured tone. Baelish has always relied on cunning over brute force. If we mount a direct assault, we play to his advantage. He wants us to appear as invaders, that he might rally the Vale's knights behind a boy lord. But if we force him to show his hand and reveal how he's truly been using Sansa and little Robert, perhaps the Vale's lords will turn on him. At that, Robb's eyes lit with consideration. We need to draw him out. Force a confrontation in a place of our choosing. But how? Brynden exhaled slowly. He's cunning as a fox, that one. We must give him something he can't resist, an opportunity too precious for him to pass up. Silence reigned. Then Robb looked at Jon. Something unspoken passed between them, a memory of their father Ned Stark, who had always believed in justice done with one's own hand, in fairness, in honesty. If Baelish is to be undone, Robb murmured, it must be by exposing his treachery. Maybe we can demand something that the Vale will recognize as within tradition. The Knights of the Vale prided themselves on chivalry and ancient custom. One such tradition rose to the forefront of Jon's mind. The Vale had a storied history of trials by combat, from the days of the first men to the Undulls. The Ares' famed Moon Door had sent many a convicted soul plummeting to the rocks below. If a man demanded trial by combat, no Arryn lord could refuse, lest they be branded unjust. Jon's voice was steady. If we confront Baelish with an accusation, one that the Vale lords cannot easily dismiss, he might be forced to answer in a trial by combat. The Vale's own traditions would demand it. But the question is, who stands champion? A hush followed. Then Robb's gaze fixed on Jon. I would name you. There was no hesitation in his tone, no uncertainty. You are my brother in every way that matters. If there's anyone I trust to win the day in single combat, it is you, Jon. Brynden's face was grim. Baelish won't fight himself. He'll name a champion of his own. Likely one of the Vale's best knights. He could choose Ser Lyn Corbray, or perhaps even someone like the formidable Bronze Yohn Royce. Whoever it is, it won't be a Lackwit. Robb gave a curt nod. Jon, you have fought and bled on the field. But this is a different test. You would stand alone. Are you willing? Jon took a breath, heart pounding. He remembered his training with the sword, the years in Castle Black, the duels in the yard at Winterfell. He remembered Core and Half-Hand in the snowy passes, and so many other trials. I will, he said simply. There was no brashness in his voice, no trace of arrogance, only acceptance, born of the vow he had once sworn to guard all men and the promise he had made to stand beside his brother. So, the plan was set into motion. Under the ruse of negotiation, Robb would ride to the Eyrie with a carefully chosen escort, enough men to prevent immediate treachery, but not so many as to threaten open war. The Vale, for its part, would not dare to slaughter a royal retinue at its doorstep. The reputational cost was too high. And if Baelish refused them or attempted harm, they would levy the formal accusation that Peter Baelish had conspired to seize power in the Vale unlawfully, abusing Sansa Stark's rightful claim and the Child Lord's vulnerability, and conspired in the murder of Lisa Arryn, a rumor Brynden Tully strongly believed was true, though not widely proven. A swirl of smaller charges could follow, including the mysterious disappearance of Sansa's maiden aunt, the overshadowing of Robert Arryn, and the forging of alliances detrimental to the Vale's autonomy. The Vale lords, steeped in tradition, would have to weigh the charges. A trial by combat would be demanded, and Baelish could not refuse without losing face. When the day came, the sky was a piercing, cloudless blue, a rare respite from the usual mists that clung to the high crags. Robb led a column of 300 men, half-knights, half-foot soldiers, up the winding pass toward the Eyrie. Jon rode beside him, wearing light mail, a plain surcoat, and a Stark cloak. The direwolf sigil on his breast was subdued but unmistakable. Behind them trotted Grey Wind, ears pricked, jaws occasionally parted in a silent snarl at the crisp air. The men were tense, though no banners fluttered with the riotous intensity of a full army. This was a show of good faith, if not exactly humility. At the final turn of the pass, they could see the Eyrie perched impossibly high, a slender tower of pale stone seemingly grown out of the mountain's top. Along the narrow road that led to its gates, archers lined the parapets. The wind carried faint echoes of the men's murmurs, the shuffle of horses, and the scrape of steel. The gate itself creaked open just as the northern party approached, revealing a courtyard that could only hold a fraction of the men. The rest would remain outside, arrayed on the mountain path, prepared if things went sour. Inside the courtyard, Jon saw Vale knights in polished plate bearing the sigils of Royce, Corbray, Waynwood, and a dozen other families. Peter Baelish stood in the center wearing a finely cut doublet of silver and emerald, a mockingbird pin gleaming at his collar. Beside him, half hidden behind a line of guards, was a slight figure that Jon recognized instantly, Sansa Stark. She wore a gown of pale sky blue, her hair woven into intricate braids that fell around her shoulders. Despite the noble finery, the sorrow in her eyes seemed inescapable. Yet upon spotting her brother Robb and then Jon, her face flickered with a fragile hope. Littlefinger bowed with courtly grace. "Your Grace," he said in that smooth voice. "You honor us with your presence in this lofty perch. May the hospitality of the airy be as unwavering as the mountains." Robb dismounted without flourish. Grey wind growled softly, and Baelish's guards took a collective step back. "I've come to speak with you, Lord Baelish," said Robb. "I trust you won't object if my men remain stationed just outside in case of misunderstandings." His tone was as cold as the mountain winds. "Of course not. There will be no misunderstandings, I assure you," Baelish replied, lips curving in a practiced smile. "And I welcome you, albeit in a smaller retinue than I'd expected." They were ushered inside the Airy's main hall. The great doors opened to reveal a soaring chamber of pale stone, arched windows, and, most ominously, the fabled moon door, a narrow portal in the floor that opened to a sheer drop thousands of feet below. Jon watched Sansa's every step as she walked near Baelish, flanked by 2 guards. He caught her eye once, offering a silent nod of reassurance. She inclined her head, but her expression remained guarded. In the hall, the Lords Declarant were summoned. They came with hawk-like eyes, uncertain whether to side with their official Lord Protector or to heed the claims of the North. Baelish conducted himself with impeccable courtesy, making hollow gestures of welcome. Wine was poured, though no one dared drink deeply. Peter tried to steer the conversation toward pleasantries, but Robb brushed them aside. After a brief exchange, Robb presented his demand. Sansa Stark was to be released into his custody, and the Vale would swear fealty to the king in the north. A hush fell. Baelish raised a perplexed brow. "My dear king, do you suspect I hold Lady Sansa against her will? She is quite free. I have been her protector since her unfortunate father's demise. She can vouch for my care." He turned to Sansa with a coaxing smile. "Tell him, my lady. Have I not treated you with every kindness?" Sansa stood rigidly, eyes flicking toward Jon and Robb. Her voice was soft. "You have treated me well enough." The statement was so devoid of warmth it made a few knights exchange glances. "But I wish to see my brother." Robb stepped forward, anger creeping into his voice. "She will not remain here another day. I have the right to my sister's guardianship." "It is not so simple," Baelish replied, feigning a regretful look. "She is also betrothed as per arrangements beneficial to the Vale and to her own standing. You cannot simply waltz in and demand that arrangement be broken." "Betrothed to whom?" Jon cut in, voice quieter yet biting. "One of the Vale's most esteemed knights, who has pledged his life to the furtherance of Lady Sansa's comfort and status. A man of impeccable lineage." Baelish's voice floated through the hall, light as silk. "He didn't mention a name. Perhaps it was Ser Harry the heir or some other puppet." Robb's gaze swept across the assembled knights. "Are you all content with this arrangement? That your child lord is kept hidden away, too ill or too frightened to appear, while his so-called protector forges alliances in his name?" A few uneasy murmurs rippled among the lords. One, an older knight with a grizzled beard, stepped forward. "We have had concerns, Lord Baelish, about the secrecy surrounding these matters. We have sworn to uphold House Arryn's honor." "Where's Lord Robert?" Baelish's thin smile never left his lips. "The boy is ill, resting. He cannot be subjected to the rigors of state business." "That's convenient," Robb said coolly. "Because I bring charges against you, Peter Baelish, for your involvement in the death of Lysa Arryn. For usurping the rightful authority of House Arryn. For the forced betrothal of my sister, a Stark of Winterfell, to advance your own hold. And more crimes too numerous to list. I accuse you before the Lords of the Vale. I demand you." "Stice." The hall erupted into hushed gasps, knights shifting on their feet. Sansa's eyes widened. Baelish's face lost some color, but only for a moment. He responded with a scoff. "How dare you come into my domain and fling baseless accusations? The Vale will not stand for this. I have done nothing but protect Lady Sansa. As for Lysa, the gods know she threw herself into a fit of madness. She leapt from the moon door in a moment of despair, and I tried to save her. Anyone claiming otherwise must provide proof." And the Vale is well aware that House Stark is hardly impartial in this matter. You can protest your innocence in a trial by combat. Robb's voice rang loud. By the ancient customs of the Vale, you must answer these charges. Fight or admit guilt. Baelish paused just a heartbeat. It is a savage tradition, he said, but if it will later rest these slanderous claims, so be it. I name my champion. He cast a glance among the Vale Knights. A murmur swept through them. Many saw the trap for what it was. If Baelish named one of them, they would fight not for him personally, but for the Vale's honor, as Baelish had woven himself into the seat of power. Some, like Ser Lyn Corbray, might leap at the chance for glory or wealth. But others were uncertain. Baelish saw a flicker of hesitation among them. I name Ser Lyn Corbray, Baelish announced, spotting the knight with the silver-buckled sword belt. Lyn Corbray smirked. He was known as a deadly fighter despite his slight build, rumored to have spilt blood in the name of the Vale with a near-manic intensity. Corbray stepped forward, drawing his sword partway out of its scabbard, the steel whispering. My blade is yours, he said to Baelish, eyeing Jon with a fiery challenge. Robb turned to Jon. And I name my champion, Jon Snow, son of Eddard Stark. A wave of whispers rippled through the knights. Jon Snow was rumored to have fought with the Night's Watch, faced wildlings beyond the wall, battled White Walkers if those stories were to be believed. Some were uncertain whether to scoff or shudder at the possibility. The high doors of the hall were opened, letting in the keen mountain air, and a circle was cleared. This was not the first time the Ares Grand Hall had hosted a trial by combat. The old stones seemed to reverberate with the memory of 100 duels. Off to the side, the moon door yawned in the floor, a black rectangle that ended in open sky. Even the dais looked upon it solemnly. Sansa stood behind Robb, face pale. She caught Jon's eye and mouthed a silent plea, "Be careful." Jon shed the heavier cloak, revealing mail that fit his frame snugly. He had a long sword at his hip, the blade gifted by Robb to replace the old, battered steel he'd once carried at the wall. He took a few steps forward, rolling his shoulders to loosen the tension. Across from him stood Lyn Corbray, stepping into the open space with a relaxed, almost predatory grace. The Vale Knight's eyes danced with a certain glee, as if reveling in the attention. One of the senior lords, presumably acting as a presiding voice, asked, "Does the accused and the accuser both accept this trial as the judgment of the gods?" Robb nodded. "We do." Baelish nodded with a careful tilt of his head, mouth set in a tight line. "Then begin." Corbray wasted no time. He lunged, sword flashing with a speed that belied his smug stance. Jon pivoted, parried with a neat clang of steel. They circled each other, boots scraping across the stones. Corbray's smirk grew as he tested Jon's defenses with quick thrusts and feints. Jon recognized the man's skill. He was indeed a dangerous fighter, striking with a precision that forced Jon to remain vigilant. But Jon had learned from the Old Bear and Ser Alliser Thorne in the practice yards, from wildling ambushes in the frozen wastes, from the dire realities of a realm beset by more than mere knights. He bided his time, letting Corbray's blade glance off his parries, saving his strength, searching for a weakness. A hush fell over the watchers, punctuated by the ring of steel on steel. Gray wind growled from behind Robb, hackles raised. Sansa's knuckles were white at her sides. Baelish stood with arms crossed, eyes calculating every step. Corbray darted in again, twisting his wrist for a diagonal slash. Jon met it, then riposted with a fluid upward swing. Sparks flew as blades met. Corbray sidestepped, letting out a sharp laugh. "My father used to say," Corbray taunted, "the best swordsman in the Vale is the one who kills the second best. I think I'll prove that right now." Jon's face remained impassive. He advanced, feinting low, then snapping his blade upward to test Corbray's reflexes. The knight deflected it with an expert block, but Jon saw the slightest shift in Corbray's footwork, a habit of leaning a fraction too far to his left when recovering from a strike. Jon stored that observation away. They danced again, swords clashing in a staccato rhythm. Onlookers craned their necks. Some tried to stifle murmurs of surprise that Jon Snow was matching Corbray blow for blow. Jon pressed forward with a sudden flurry, driving Corbray back a few steps. The knight recovered with a sneer, launching a counter-assault that forced Jon to retreat. They circled once more. Sweat beaded on Corbray's brow despite the chill. Jon's breathing grew faster, each breath a small cloud in the cold air. They locked blades, straining. Corbray hissed, twisting to try to throw Jon off balance, but Jon stood firm. Their swords slid free. Corbray darted back, then lunged forward, aiming for Jon's torso. Jon parried, but the angle was off. The tip of Corbray's blade sliced Jon's arm, drawing blood. A collective gasp went up from the watchers. Pain flared, but Jon gritted his teeth. He stepped back, flexing the wounded arm. The cut wasn't deep, but it stung fiercely. Corbray pressed the advantage, raining blows. Jon gave ground, letting him think victory was at hand. Then Jon twisted his stance in a half-pivot, hooking Corbray's blade away and slamming his pommel into the knight's jaw. Corbray stumbled, spitting blood. Jon didn't hesitate. He followed with a sweeping slash. Corbray narrowly dodged, though the edge of Jon's blade nicked his flank. Now both men were bleeding, blood seeping into their clothes. The onlookers were deathly silent. Only the sound of ragged breathing and the ring of steel disturbed the hush. Corbray's eyes burned with fury. He rushed in a reckless charge, hoping to catch Jon off guard. But Jon had spent his entire life being told he was the unwanted son. Overlooked, forced to prove himself. He responded to adversity with discipline. He sidestepped, letting Corbray's momentum carry him forward, then pivoted to deliver a telling blow across the knight's back. Corbray let out a strangled gasp, stumbling to a knee. His sword arm wavered, but he lifted his weapon again. Jon respected the man's resolve. In another life, perhaps they could have been sparring in a yard. But duty demanded an end. Corbray lunged desperately, sword trembling. Jon batted it aside with a firm downward strike, then aimed a lethal thrust at Corbray's chest. At the last moment, Corbray tried to twist away. The steel found flesh near his shoulder, driving him back. He slipped on his own blood, dropped his blade, and fell onto his side, panting. For a second, Jon hesitated, sword raised. He glanced at Robb, then at the silent lords of the Vale. By their own laws, if the champion yielded or was clearly defeated, the verdict was declared. But Corbray was not calling for yield, even though he lay on the flagstones. With a trembling hand, he reached for his dropped sword. He never made it. Jon placed his boot on the blade, pressing it firmly to the floor. Corbray stared up in defiance, but pain and blood loss were quickly unraveling him. Jon lowered his sword tip to the knight's throat. A hush. Time seemed suspended until Corbray's eyes fluttered shut and he exhaled raggedly, the fight gone. The watchers knew it was done. Jon withdrew the blade. He let Corbray live, though the man would need immediate care. A trial by combat did not always require a killing blow. The outcome was clear. Baelish's champion lay defeated. In the eyes of the Vale's ancient tradition, the gods had passed judgment. A soft murmuring filled the hall. Some knights visibly relaxed, as if relieved that the cunning manipulator's champion had failed. The older lord who had presided raised his voice, addressing Baelish. The gods have spoken. The champion of the king in the north is victorious. How do you answer for these charges? Baelish's face was a study in subtle panic and forced calm. His eyes darted, calculating escape routes. He tried a small, crooked smile. My lords, clearly the so-called trial is an unfortunate travesty. Serlin must have been unwell or perhaps tricked into submission. This is preposterous. One sword duel does not unravel the complexities of governance. Robb stepped forward, gray wind growling at his heel. By your own Vale laws, by your agreement to the trial, you stand convicted. If you do not accept your guilt, then stand up yourself and fight me or fight Jon. But I doubt you'd make it 2 strokes. A swirl of confusion and anger erupted among the Vale lords. Some demanded Baelish's immediate arrest. Others seemed uncertain, torn by the fear that Baelish's supporters might retaliate. Sansa used the clamor to slip past the guards, rushing into Robb's arms. She trembled, tears threatening to fall. Robb held her gently, while Jon, sword still unsheathed, turned his attention back to Baelish. At that moment, a high, reedy voice echoed through the hall. What is the meaning of all this noise? The crowd parted to reveal the child Lord Robert Arryn, pale and thin, led in by a pair of attendants. He looked at the scene with wide eyes. Baelish stiffened, realization dawning that his control of the situation was slipping. The child lord's presence offered the Vale an official figurehead. Baelish tried to move toward Robert Arryn, but the knights parted to let the boy walk to the dais. The older lord presiding cleared his throat. My lord, A trial by combat was held. Lord Baelish lost. By our laws, he must be judged for the crimes laid against him. Robert Arryn, only half understanding, looked to Baelish with a mix of fear and confusion. "Is it true?" he asked in a wavering voice. "You hurt my mother?" Baelish tried to soothe the boy with a fatherly tone. "Robert, my sweet boy, your mother was ill. She jumped, and I tried." But Sansa stepped forward, voice tinged with sorrow and anger. "Lord Robert, Peter Baelish confessed to me in private that he pushed your mother when she threatened me. That was not precisely what happened, but the gist was close enough to the truth that Baelish's guilt was undeniable. I beg you, my lord, see justice done." The child lord's lips trembled. Fear and confusion warred in his eyes, but he looked around at the knights of the Vale, who waited for him to speak. If he killed my mother, then he should go through the moon door," the boy mumbled. A wave of tension roiled through the hall. Baelish turned pale as new-fallen snow. He made a desperate attempt to gather support. "Knights of the Vale, do not listen to these spurious claims. I have guided you all these months, kept the Vale safe, without me." But a cluster of the Lords Declarant stepped forward with cold resolve. The older one, possibly Yohn Royce, seized Baelish by the arm. "You stand accused, Baelish. The gods have spoken. The rightful Lord of the Vale commands your sentencing." Baelish's silver tongue floundered. He looked from face to face, found no mercy. In that moment, he might have tried to slip a hidden dagger into Robert Arryn's side or hold Sansa hostage if he'd had the chance. But Jon, still bloodied from the duel, was already upon him, blade at the ready. "You'll not escape," Jon murmured. Soldiers rushed in, binding Baelish's arms. His eyes flickered with 1,000 swirling thoughts. He tried one last trick. "Sansa, tell them. You owe me your life. I saved you from King's Landing. Without me, you'd have perished." She turned her face away, tears slipping from her lashes. "You saved me only to use me." At that, Baelish's shoulders sagged. With terrifying swiftness, the Vale's lords carried out the sentence. Half dragging him across the cold stones, they shoved open the moon door. Wind whistled up from the dizzying chasm. Baelish looked around, panic contorting his features. He tried to cling to the stone floor. In a final, desperate snarl, he cursed them all, cursed the Vale, cursed the Starks, spat vile accusations. But it did not matter. The men gave a final heave, and Peter Baelish, Lord Protector of the Vale, screamed once in mortal terror before his voice was swallowed by the wind. In the hush that followed, Robert Arryn trembled, the weight of what he had just witnessed perhaps too much for his fragile mind. Sansa moved to comfort him, kneeling at his side, whispering gentle words. The Vale Knights, some in shock, some in grim satisfaction, turned to the king in the north. In a single day, their domain had shifted drastically. Brynden Tully stepped forward, kneeling to Robb. "My king," he said, loud enough for all to hear. "The Vale is yours to command if Lord Arryn will bend the knee." Yohn Royce inclined his head solemnly, though it was the child lord's decision that held official sway. Robert Arryn stared at Robb, then Sansa, tears in his eyes. "If you promise the Vale won't be hurt," he sniffled. "Then, I bend the knee." Robb knelt beside him, placing a reassuring hand on the boy's shoulder. "The North does not seek to harm the Vale. We seek allies in these uncertain times. You will remain Lord of the Airy, Robert Arryn. But the Vale will stand with the North." A sense of release washed over the hall. Jon let himself exhale. The wound in his arm throbbed, a dull reminder of the trial he had endured. He exchanged a glance with Sansa, who managed a tremulous smile. Robb wasted no time. He directed the knights to tend to Corbray's injuries. He would live, though he might never forgive the indignity, and to ensure order was kept in the Airy. Over the course of the next hours, a flurry of activity whirled through the fortress. Servants scurried. Knights debated among themselves. Baelish's personal guard either fled or surrendered. A few diehards were placed in the cells. By evening, Robb's men had streamed into the courtyard, securing the fortress without any large-scale bloodshed. And so, as the sun dipped behind the peaks, casting long shadows across the Airy, the Vale had a new direction. Jon stood on one of the parapets, gazing out at the breathtaking expanse of mountains that stretched to the horizon. His arm was freshly bandaged, the pain dulled by a salve from the maester's stores. The wind teased his dark curls, stirring the cloak at his back. He stared at the jagged silhouettes of distant peaks, remembering nights on the wall, the howling winds of the frostfangs, the eerie silence of the haunted forest. The Vale was different, yet it shared the same harsh beauty that only the North could truly appreciate. He sensed a presence beside him and turned to find Sansa. She had changed into a simpler gown, more comfortable. Her hair was loose, the braids undone. Purple shadows rimmed her eyes from lack of sleep and prolonged stress. Yet she seemed relieved as if finally able to breathe freely. "Jon," she whispered, voice lost in the wind. "You saved me." He shook his head. "Robb saved you. He engineered the plan. I was only his sword." She looked down, her fingers trailing along the cold stone of the parapet. "When I was in King's Landing, I used to dream of escape. Then Peter whisked me away, promising safety, and for a time, I believed him. I felt indebted, but I soon realized I was just a piece on his board. In the Vale, he was kinder than the Lannisters, but no less manipulative. I was so afraid no one would ever come for me. When I heard word that you and Robb were in the valley, I hardly dared hope. Now it feels like a dream." Jon placed a gentle hand on her arm. "It's not a dream. You're free, and you'll come home to the North with us." She let out a shaky breath. "Winterfell, is it truly ours again?" "Aye," he said quietly. "Robb reclaimed it. Much has changed. Some of it is painful to speak of. But we're together now. That's what matters." She nodded, tears glimmering in her eyes. They stood in companionable silence, each carrying scars of their own journeys. Finally, Sansa spoke again. "Thank you for fighting, for risking your life." Jon didn't know how to answer. He felt a mixture of relief and sorrow. So much had been lost, but here they were, forging a new path. "For family, for the North, I would do anything," he said. "And you are my family, Sansa." She reached out, taking his hand. They stood that way as dusk settled, a quiet moment of solace in the midst of a world still ravaged by war and uncertainty. Below, in the Airy's great hall, Robb and Brynden Tully conferred with the lords of the Vale, hammering out the particulars of their alliance. The boy Lord Robert Arryn listened drowsily, nodding when prompted, comforted at last by the presence of a king who seemed more stable and gentle than Baelish ever had. They agreed on a formal vow of fealty. The Vale would supply knights, provisions, and safe passage for the northern armies. Robb, in turn, would guarantee the Vale's autonomy within its own region, with only the expectation that they rally to him in times of war. In the days that followed, a transformation took hold. Sansa was given a place of honor, reuniting with Robb openly. Jon oversaw the slow integration of the northern men into the Vale's defenses. The roads were finally safe for travelers, and the Child Lord's attendants began to see that the king's presence brought an odd sense of security. Word spread that Baelish had met his end via the Vale's own tradition, and that the king in the north had not forced their hand but merely demanded justice. An undercurrent of respect for Robb began to flourish among the Vale knights, who admired that he had not come with immediate violence but rather adhered to their laws. Jon found himself unexpectedly popular with many of the younger squires. They flocked to watch him train in the courtyard, some enamored by the rumor that he had once fought beyond the wall, that he knew how to slay monstrous creatures of ice and shadow. Even a few knights approached him with cautious respect, acknowledging that he had bested Lyn Corbray in fair combat. For Jon, the attention was a bit unsettling, yet it allowed him to share the discipline and skill he had honed over years of hardship. In a quiet moment, he thought how his father, Ned Stark, would be proud to see him forging alliances through shared respect and honest skill, rather than intimidation. One evening, as a cold rain battered the mountain peaks, Jon joined Robb, Sansa, and the Blackfish in the airy solar, a smaller chamber warmed by a crackling fire. Maps were spread across a table detailing the roads that led from the Vale into the riverlands and from there to the Neck and beyond. They discussed the realm's dire state. King's Landing was held by Tommen Baratheon, the Lannisters pulling his strings. The Tyrell alliance still stood in the south, though rumors of discord rose with each passing day. The Ironborn were restless on the coasts. In the north, pockets of resistance had to be managed carefully, especially with the Boltons mostly quashed but some loyalists still skulking and overshadowing. All mortal conflicts was the threat from beyond the wall, though few in the south believed the stories of White Walkers. Sansa listened quietly, absorbing the scale of the war. Robb explained that by securing the Vale they had gained a strategic location from which to press the Lannisters if needed. Brynden observed that they could also send supply lines safely north, a boon for the winter that was fast approaching. Jon, leaning over the table, pointed to the Frostfangs. We cannot forget what looms beyond. We've had no ravens from the Wall in ages. If the worst is happening, the realm must be united. Robb nodded solemnly, though a flicker of guilt crossed his face. The war for the North's independence had pulled him away from the deeper threat. Now, with some measure of stability, he felt the old urgency returning. We must rally everyone we can. The Vale's nights will be invaluable if we must ride north. But first, we ensure the Lannisters cannot take advantage of our distraction. We'll travel to the riverlands. Then we'll see if the time is ripe to strike at King's Landing or to broker a truce that frees us to face the real enemy. The meeting stretched on, Sansa occasionally offering her perspective on the courtiers in King's Landing on how the Lannisters operated. The Blackfish talked about the Riverlords, many still loyal to House Tully. Jon remained focused on the north, wanting to ensure that the Watchers on the Wall had the supplies they needed. By night's end, they had a tentative plan. The combined forces of the Vale and the North would gather in the Riverlands, regroup with the Tully bannermen, and see if a swift blow could force the Lannisters into a treaty. If that succeeded, the realm might finally unite against the looming darkness. If not, well, they would fight on. Word traveled swiftly of Littlefinger's downfall. To some, it was a cause for celebration, the cunning climber undone by his own arrogance. To others, it was a sobering reminder that the once fragmented North had become a power to be reckoned with. Ravens flitted out from the airy, carrying messages of new alliances and demands that other houses declare where they stood. Meanwhile, Sansa penned her own letters. She wrote to what remained of her mother's connections in the south, gently urging them to acknowledge the North's sovereignty and to see reason. She wrote to a few distant allies, explaining that she was safe and that the king in the north was not a savage conqueror. She wrote, too, to old acquaintances in King's Landing, uncertain if they would respond. The gentle scratching of her quill in the Airy's library became a constant background hum. She found a sliver of purpose in diplomacy, bridging the gentle courtesies she had learned as a hostage with her renewed loyalty to her family. Jon began to heal from his wound, though it scarred. Each morning, he rose before the sunrise, sometimes climbing to the Airy's highest balcony to watch the dawn break over the jagged peaks. The air was thin and sharp there, the sky an endless tapestry of pink and gold. He would think of the icy wastes beyond the wall, of the friends he had lost, Sam, PYP, Gren, and so many more who had once stood beside him. Sometimes he thought of Ygritte, the wildling woman who had taught him about love and the cost of duty. The wind carried those memories away, scattering them into the silent sky. He spent time sparring in the courtyard with Vale knights. They drilled together, forging camaraderie that might serve them well on the battlefield. He spoke little, but the Vale men seemed intrigued by his calm presence, perhaps sensing in him something of the quiet steel that Ned Stark once possessed. Days turned into a fortnight. The Northmen who had camped around the Airy's approaches found shelter and supplies. The Vale's own men seemed mostly relieved that open warfare had been averted. Robert Arryn, under the guidance of a newly appointed council led by Yohn Royce and overseen by the Blackfish, continued to hold the title of Lord of the Airy. Though frail and often lost in his own fears, the boy lord took comfort in the routine and in Sansa's gentle friendship. Together, they would play a game of chess-like tactics with wooden knights and lords, ironically teaching the boy about strategy while occupying his anxious mind. Finally, the day of departure came. The combined forces would march down the Vale's winding passes, heading for the Trident. Robb, as king, would lead the vanguard, while Jon took a secondary command, guiding the rear guard. Sansa, determined yet nervous, would ride under the banner of House Stark, flanked by guards sworn to protect her. It was a grand column, thousands of northern spearmen and cavalry, alongside ranks of Vale knights shining in new lacquered armor, carrying falcon and moon sigils. It was the first time in many generations that the Vale and the North marched together under one cause. Standing at the top of the pass before they began the descent, Robb and Jon surveyed the line of soldiers winding along the mountain road. Robb was quiet, but there was a faint lift in his posture. He wore the heavy mantle of kingship, stark gray with the dire wolf at his back, yet he carried it with a maturity forged by pain and necessity. Jon, at his side, felt a measure of pride in what they had accomplished. The two brothers, once children of Winterfell, had united their fractured lands. Sansa approached on a graceful mare, her gown replaced by more practical riding attire, though still bearing the Stark colors. She drew up beside Robb and Jon, the wind ruffling her auburn hair. Are we truly doing this? She asked, voice filled with quiet wonder. Riding forth together? Robb nodded, a slight smile on his lips. Together. No matter what awaits us in the riverlands or beyond, we face it as Starks. He turned, clasping Sansa's hand, then clasping Jon's forearm, a gesture of brotherhood. The three of them sat astride their horses, a living testament to House Stark's resilience. If they had to fight the Lannisters, if they had to battle the cynicism of the South, if they had to stand against the ancient horrors stirring in the far north, they would do so united. The column began its march. Hooves clopped on stone, banners stirred in the crisp air, and the sound of measured footsteps echoed through the pass. The horizon before them shimmered with possibility and peril alike. Robb led the way, gray wind padding at his side, ears perked as though searching for new threats. Jon rode nearby, scanning the cliff edges with a practiced eye, mindful that old ways of warfare could still surprise them. And Sansa followed, flanked by Vale knights who had pledged to guard her life, a quiet resolve settling around her. As they descended the mountains, the air grew warmer, the path broader. The men murmured about the fields and farmlands they would soon see, where autumn colors lingered and harvests awaited. The Vale's foot soldiers and the Northmen intermingled, forging friendships over shared skins of ale and stories of hunts. Each step forward took them closer to the riverlands, where new challenges would arise. Rumors of Lannister musters near Harrenhal flickered through the camps. Talk of Freys who still held grudges. Mention of outlaws and broken men wandering the war-ravaged countryside. But the hearts of the marchers were buoyed by a sense of something unstoppable. They had toppled Baelish without raising a pitched battle, using the Vale's own laws. They had secured an alliance once thought impossible. Jon's duel with Lyn Corbray had become almost legend among the foot soldiers, told and retold around nighttime fires. Sansa's presence offered a symbol of northern pride and a link to the Vale's revered memory of Catelyn Tully. Robb Stark, proven in war, had gained new respect from Southerners who once dismissed him as a green boy. On the third day of the descent, they passed the Bloody Gate without resistance. The fortress that had once stood closed against them now welcomed them. The men stationed there nodded in respect as Robb and Jon rode by. On the far side of the gate, an open road stretched onward. A few travelers gawked at the column, stumbling aside as the mass of steel and flesh rolled forward. Merchants, seeing the banners, scrambled to offer wares or gather gossip. In the wake of Baelish's downfall, the news spread like wildfire, changing the political map overnight. Jon found himself recalling the trial by combat in snatches of memory, the ring of steel, Corbray's sneer, the moment he realized he could exploit the man's footwork. He felt no pride in the blood spilled, yet he could not deny a certain grim satisfaction that he had helped unmask Baelish's treachery. As a boy in Winterfell, he had daydreamed about being acknowledged, about being useful. Now he realized his place was at his family's side, not for glory but because it was right. At midday, the long column halted for rest. Water was shared, horses were fed and watered at a nearby stream, and the men relaxed in the shade of a stand of cedars. Sansa walked among the soldiers, a light smile on her face as she offered them thanks, mindful of how generosity and kindness could bind hearts better than any forced oath. Jon sat on a fallen log, tending to the bandage on his arm. The cut from Corbray still smarted, though it had begun to knit. A young squire offered to rewrap it with fresh linens. Jon nodded his thanks, quietly enduring the sting of antiseptic. Robb approached him, the remnants of a grin ghosting his lips. "The men speak your name often," he said, crouching down beside Jon. "They have a new champion to admire." Jon managed a wry smile. "I did what needed doing. Corbray was good, but I had luck on my side." "Luck or the old gods," Robb said. "Or maybe just skill. I'm proud of you, Jon. I wish Father could see the man you've become." Jon lowered his gaze, emotions welling. He remembered Ned Stark's quiet lessons, the warmth of his rare smiles. "I only hope to honor his memory." Robb laid a hand on Jon's shoulder. "You have. And you will again. We've won a great victory, but the journey isn't over. The realm is in chaos. Yet for the first time, I feel we have a real chance to shape it into something better. Not just for the North, but for all of Westeros. We'll see if the Lannisters will parley or if they'll force our hand. Beyond that, there is still the matter of the White Walkers. The moment we have enough stability, I want your counsel on how to strengthen the wall." Jon nodded, remembering the silent, looming threat. "We'll need every able body. The Vale's knights will help, but we'll need more. The great houses must unite or we'll face the darkness alone. Then let's pray our next battles are swift. Robb rose, adjusting his cloak. We ride again soon. See you back in the saddle. Jon watched his brother walk away, chatting with a passing sergeant about the quality of the horses. For a moment, Jon allowed himself the rare comfort of hope. Perhaps with the Vale secured, Sansa safe, and Baelish gone, they could indeed forge a new path. After the men were rested, the march resumed. By dusk, they had reached the low foothills where the terrain flattened into wide, fertile plains. Autumn crops swayed in the breeze. Farmers appeared at a distance, warily eyeing the large column but deciding not to flee. A handful approached, hoping to sell produce. The northern quartermasters bartered on behalf of the army. Soon, baskets of apples, loaves of bread, and barrels of ale were passed around. The men feasted modestly, grateful for something fresher than hardtack and salt beef. At night, they made camp. Fires dotted the plain, flickering under a canopy of stars. Sansa retired early, exhausted. Robb held a final war council with Brynden Tully and the Vale leaders, finalizing the next day's route. Jon wandered the camp, listening to the talk of small folk who had joined the column seeking safety, hearing stories of how outlaws roamed the war-torn riverlands. Some recognized him as the victor of the trial by combat, asking him for blessings or protection. Feeling awkward, Jon offered them quiet reassurances. He was no lord, no king, just a brother to the king in the north and a man who had faced shadows in the far north. Still, he gave what comfort he could, remembering how intangible hope had felt when he was younger. The next morning brought a crisp dawn. They set out anew, the pace steady. By midday, the spires of the Vale were just a memory, replaced by rolling fields. The talk in the ranks was of the river lords, whether House Frey would cause trouble, whether the Blackfish could rally the Tully banner once more, whether the Lannisters would deploy from Harrenhal. Through all these rumors and speculations, the determined beat of hooves and feet moved on. On a gentle rise, Jon paused, looking back. He could see the faint outlines of the mountains, distant and pale, where the airy perched far beyond sight. In that fortress, a cunning spider had spun his webs only to be cast down by the same tradition he manipulated. Jon's arm still ached, but it was a reminder of how close victory and defeat could be. If he had lost, if he had fallen to Corbray's blade, Baelish might still be enthroned in the Vale, forging new betrayals that would inevitably doom House Stark. Instead, the future lay open. Danger still lurked, in the form of Lannisters, the threat beyond the wall, and the unknown alliances shifting like shadows. But at least the North was not alone. The Vale marched with them. Sansa was free. That was enough for Jon to kindle a spark of hope in his heart. He spurred his horse forward, rejoining the column, not allowing himself to linger in the past. The road ahead was their destiny now. It was a winding path, fraught with battles and heartbreaks yet to come, but they would face it, because when the king in the north had demanded justice for House Stark, he had found it in the Vale and named Jon Snow as his champion. And though many feared the winter that approached, a quiet determination held them firm. They were Starks and their allies, and winter was not only a season, but a clarion call to stand together or fall. So the host continued westward, a long serpent of steel and banners, forging a new chapter in the history of Westeros, one that would shape the realm for generations to come. And high in the mountains, the winds whistled around the abandoned webs of a lord who had climbed too far, only to be cast into the void, while the pillars of the Vale stood resolute beneath the unblinking sky. The tide of war had shifted, and the Vale's gates were now open wide to the new age ushered in by the king in the north and his champion, Jon Snow. They rode west through the whispering grasses of the foothills, leaving behind the jagged peaks of the Vale. The autumn sun stretched long shadows across the column of men, horses, and wagons, making it seem as if an entire kingdom moved with them. In a sense, it did. The king in the north, Robb Stark, led his combined force of Northmen and Vale Knights, weaving their way toward the riverlands, toward the heart of an uncertain future. No subtitles marked their progress. Only the steady rhythm of hoofbeats and the clink of armor set the tempo of this new chapter in the war-torn realm. Jon Snow rode near the rearguard, methodically checking that his men marched in good order and that no stragglers fell behind. At times, he would slow his mount to speak with foot soldiers who had begun to limp from minor injuries, offering what comfort he could. When possible, he ordered them placed on the slower wagons carrying supplies. It was a small kindness, but in the weeks since the trial by combat, Jon had grown accustomed to such acts of quiet leadership. He had never sought the spotlight, yet it found him at every turn. Word of his duel with Ser Lyn Corbray had swept through the forces, and many of the younger knights of the Vale regarded him with a blend of awe and curiosity. Jon tolerated their admiration with typical Stark reserve, his mind drifting often to the tasks ahead, forging alliances in the riverlands, bracing for a potential confrontation with the Lannisters, and preparing, if the gods were good, for an eventual march north to reinforce the wall. The swirl of plans never quite left his thoughts, even when the road stretched endlessly under a calm sky. After a few days of steady progress, they reached lands that were neither wholly in the Vale nor fully in the riverlands, a place of rolling hills, deep-set streams, and farmland battered by years of war. The scars were everywhere: half-collapsed barns, scorched fields, villages shuttered and abandoned. A hush lingered among the soldiers, for many recognized that these scenes had repeated themselves throughout the War of the Five Kings. Robb Stark had once led armies here, forging alliances with the River Lords to throw back the Lannisters. Now he returned, older and tempered by heartbreak, determined to restore some semblance of order. But the question hung in the chill autumn air: would the lords of these lands rise up to join him again, or had they been too battered by betrayal and false kings to follow anyone? Sansa Stark rode nearer the front with her brother Robb, under guard by a mix of Northmen and Vale knights. She displayed a quiet composure, speaking softly with those who approached. The soldiers treated her with reverence that was half fealty, half pity. They remembered how she had been a hostage in King's Landing, then presumably sequestered in the Vale under Peter Baelish's manipulations. Her reappearance now, free and resolute, signaled a chance for renewal. They saw in her the dignity of their late Lady Catelyn Tully, whose memory was revered in the Riverlands. Sansa's presence reassured them that the old ties to House Tully might yet be rekindled. She spent her days speaking with the Vale Lords, quietly encouraging them to embrace the alliance with the North. Even the child Lord Robert Arryn, who remained behind in the Airy under the watchful eyes of a Regency Council, had offered his formal blessing. Though his signature meant little in the eyes of calculating Southern lords, it lent a veneer of legitimacy to the Union. As they descended from the foothills, the first checkpoint of note lay in a broad valley. There, an ancient watchtower called the Stone Whistle Sword in lonely vigil, once used to signal the approach of enemies across the plain. After generations of peace, it had been largely abandoned. Now, a squad of scouts loyal to House Royce had taken residence, having established an outpost for the Vale's newly combined forces. Robb called a brief halt, exchanging words with the scout commander. Reports suggested that groups of bandits and broken men roamed near the Trident, harrying travelers and looting what little they could find. Worse still were the rumors that a party of Freys had been sighted, armed and roving along the main roads. At the name Frey, a flicker of raw anger crossed Robb's face and darkened the eyes of those who remembered the Red Wedding. Though the great Jon had once roared that every Frey deserved a traitor's death, Robb had since tempered such sentiments with caution. The North could not fight everyone at once, and the time might come when strategic necessity took precedence over vengeance. Yet none among them had forgotten or forgiven that treachery. They pressed on, a hush settling over the company as they advanced deeper into the riverlands. Here the air smelled of damp earth and rotting leaves. The fringes of forest closed in around the road, their thinning branches arching overhead in a skeletal canopy. Twilight cast the world in dusky purples and grays. Each evening, the army camped in orderly rows, ringed by watchfires. Robb's pavilion was pitched in the center, and Sansa stayed in her own modest tent nearby, attended by a handful of ladies who had followed her from the Vale. The nights felt colder than they had in the mountains, perhaps because the wind carried memories of war across these plains. Jon seldom slept well. Old habits from the night's watch made him light of rest, and his thoughts churned over the tasks looming ahead. Sometimes, standing watch on the perimeter of camp, he would catch sight of distant lights moving under the trees. Scouting parties or perhaps outlaws. Once, near midnight, a small group of strangers approached, battered peasants seeking the protection of the northern host. Jon allowed them to speak with one of Robb's lieutenants, who asked them questions about the roads ahead. The peasants shook their heads, warning of cutthroats, men who wore mismatched bits of armor and carried no lord's banner. The talk put Jon on edge. The realm was collapsing under the weight of chaos, and it would be up to Robb and his allies to restore a semblance of law. But law in the Riverlands was complicated by the region's fractured loyalties. House Tully had been dispossessed of Riverrun after the Red Wedding, with Edmure Tully taken captive by the Freys. Brynden the Blackfish Tully had escaped, mounting his own resistance for a time, only to vanish into the countryside. In this what-if path, however, Tully had spent some time in the Vale before rejoining Robb. Now, he was very much alive and riding alongside the king in the north. His presence lent legitimacy to their cause among the riverlords, who still remembered the Tully name with respect and sorrow. If any single figure could rally them once more, it was the Blackfish. But the question remained, was it too late? Around the 10th day of their journey, the combined forces reached a small tributary of the Trident. It was there, while searching for a suitable ford to cross, that they encountered their first serious challenge. A band of mounted men wearing patched cloaks and battered half-helms appeared on the far bank, blocking the shallow crossing. They bore no clear sigil, though one carried a tattered banner that might have been a fish sigil painted over with a crude wolf's head. It was impossible to discern at a distance. Their leader, a squat man with a hooked nose, shouted across the water, "Halt! This crossing belongs to the free riders of the Trident. Turn back or pay the toll." Robb, who rode at the head with his personal guard, reined in his horse. Gray wind padded by his stirrup, hackles raised. The sight of the dire wolf alone made several of the free riders shift nervously. Robb's voice carried cool authority as he called back, "By whose authority do you levy this toll? I am Robb Stark, king in the north, and these lands are under my protection." A murmur rippled among the free riders. Their leader scowled, perhaps uncertain whether to believe that this was indeed the famed king in the north, returned from rumored death. At last, the man spat on the ground. "We have no king here. We keep these roads safe from outlaws. If you want to cross, pay in gold." John rode up beside Robb, scanning the opposing group. There couldn't have been more than 30 or 40. The Northern Vale host numbered in the thousands. Yet the terrain was tricky. A direct attack across a narrow ford could be costly. Beyond that, these men might be riverlanders, once loyal to House Tully, now reduced to a vigilante existence. Robb considered a moment, then lifted his voice again. "Lay down your arms and join us. You claim to defend these lands from outlaws, but I have the rightful authority of House Tully behind me." He nodded toward the Blackfish, who sat on his horse a short distance away, arms crossed as he eyed the free riders. "We aim to restore order here, to feed and protect the small folk and rid them of brigands. If you stand with us, you'll have a rightful place in the new order. If you refuse, or if you stand against us, you'll be branded as outlaws yourselves." The free riders conferred, glancing among themselves with agitation. Their leader shot a nervous look at the mass of northern steel behind Robb. Even from across the water, it was evident that they were outmatched. But perhaps they believed they had little left to lose. Finally, the squat man with the hooked nose jerked his head. Some of his companions lowered their bows, others didn't. He called back, "Words mean nothing. House Tully is scattered. House Fry holds riverrun. They'll kill anyone who marches under the trout banner." Tully urged his horse forward with a snort. "If Fry thinks himself the rightful lord of riverrun, let him step forward and prove it. My nephew Edmure is a captive, yes, but House Tully is not dead while I draw breath. Surrender now or face the full might of the king in the north." John noticed how the free riders hesitated at the mention of the phrase. The Red Wedding had stained the Fry name forever in these parts. Yet fear of House Frey's menacing garrisons might still keep them from risking open allegiance to Robb. By now, the remainder of the Northern Vale column had begun spreading out behind their king, ranks of men bristling with spears and swords. A silent tension thickened the air, broken only by the soft rush of water over the ford. One of the free riders suddenly knocked an arrow. Before he could loose it, the squat man slapped his hand down. "Wait," he barked. Then he turned back to Robb. "We can't just hand over everything we have. The last time lords marched through, we lost our homes, our families. We've been bled dry. Where were you then?" John felt the sting of that question. Indeed, the war had left many abandoned. Robb's face tightened, but he answered without anger. "I was betrayed. My men were betrayed. Yet I return now not as a conqueror, but to rebuild alliances. If you come into my service, I promise you'll have a place in the new riverlands. But if you stand against me, I'll have no choice but to treat you as foes." A flicker of resignation crossed the free riders' faces. One by one, their bows dropped. The squat man exhaled, lowering his own sword. "Swear it, then. Swear that you won't turn us over to the Freys. Swear that you'll protect us from retribution if we ride under your banner." Robb nodded, his voice calm. "I swear it by the old gods and the new." Then he turned to the Blackfish, who nudged his horse through the shallow water. the Tully trout sigil stark on his surcoat. The free riders stared at him with wide eyes, murmuring recognition of the famed blackfish. Brynden spoke in a firm tone. "Swear your fealty here, and you will not be cast aside. But break faith, and the consequences will be dire." The free riders exchanged uneasy glances. Then they dismounted and knelt at the river's edge, muddy water lapping around their boots. One by one, they swore to serve House Tully and Robb Stark, king in the north, in exchange for protection. The tension in the air loosened. Robb ordered that a small portion of supplies be given to them, food staples, medical salves, a few spare cloaks. In return, the squat man, who called himself Gendron, offered to guide the column past known brigand ambush sites. For the first time, Jon saw hope flicker in the man's eyes, as if he'd never expected to be welcomed into a real army again. That night, camp was made on the western bank. The new arrivals ate warily among the Northmen and Vale knights, unsure if they should trust these lords. Jon took the opportunity to speak with them, quietly gathering details about local conditions. They told him that most villages east of Riverrun had been abandoned. Some small folk had tried to return after hearing rumors that the Lannisters were pulling back, only to find the Freys entrenched in the castle. Bands of rootless men wandered the roads, easy prey for any petty lord or unscrupulous Sellsword. Gendron mentioned seeing Frey outriders patrolling in small groups, harassing peasants to gather tribute. "I wouldn't be surprised if they know you're coming," he warned Jon. "They'll send word back to Riverrun." Jon relayed this to Robb, who took the news grimly. "Let them know," he said. "We have no reason to hide. We mean to free my uncle Edmure, restore House Tully, and secure an alliance that can stand against the Lannisters if it comes to war again." His gaze shifted to Sansa, who sat by a campfire with a knitted shawl around her shoulders, listening to the Vale Knights discuss tactics. "We also have to ensure Sansa's safety. The Freys might covet her as a political tool, seeing as she's the heir to Winterfell in many southern eyes." Brynden Tully, arms folded, stood near. "They'll try more than that," he said bluntly. "If they think we can be undone, they'll attempt to capture or kill any Stark they can." Then he glanced at Jon. "But they'll find a surprise in Jon Snow. You did well in the Vale, lad." Jon swallowed. He still felt uneasy when praised, particularly by the likes of the Blackfish. "I only did my duty," he said simply. "I'll do it again should the Freys press us." They spoke long into the night, planning how to approach Riverrun. A direct assault on the castle could cost countless lives, for the fortress was formidable, perched on the banks of the Red Fork of the Trident. Yet if the local river lords rose at Robb's call, they might surround Riverrun and blockade it, forcing the Freys to negotiate. The concern was that House Frey might hold Edmure Tully hostage against a siege, threatening to kill him if Robb and the Blackfish pressed too hard. It was a precarious game of strategy and moral conflict, reminiscent of the cruelty House Frey had already shown at the Twins. The next morning, under a sky of swirling gray clouds, they broke camp and continued west. Gendron and his free riders rode at the vanguard now, calling out potential choke points where outlaws might lurk. Twice, they found the remains of bandit ambushes, fresh corpses in the ditch, horses with severed reins, a shattered cart. The men exchanged uneasy looks. Sansa, seeing the carnage from a distance, pressed a hand to her mouth, shaken. She'd witnessed horrors in King's Landing, but the raw brutality of ungoverned war in the countryside was something else entirely. Nonetheless, she set her jaw and continued, refusing to show weakness. If she was to represent the face of House Stark and Tully kindness, she wanted to demonstrate courage as well. Brynden Tully rode beside her for a time, telling her of the riverlands as he remembered them in his youth. Fertile fields, busy market towns, and proud lords who rallied under her grandfather's banners. Sansa listened with a wistful expression, imagining a land unscarred by conflict. Perhaps, she thought, if they could restore the Tully seat at Riverrun, rebuild alliances with the houses Lannister, Bracken, Blackwood, and others, the riverlands might heal. On the horizon, the Red Fork shimmered under the pale sunlight, broad and placid. Beyond it lay the patchwork fields that had once supplied Riverrun with ample harvests. Crows circled overhead, their cries echoing in the stillness. As the column advanced, they passed peasants toiling in small plots, gleaning the last of the autumn vegetables. Some stopped to stare, uncertain whether to flee. Gendron's free riders waved them closer, urging them to speak with Robb's men. Word spread that the king in the north traveled among them, promising fair treatment. Cautiously, these small folk began to trickle forward, some kneeling in the road, others simply peering around wagons. Here and there, an old farmer would remove his cap and bow, blinking in disbelief as if expecting to be cut down at any moment. Robb ordered that no one was to harass or steal from the peasants. Instead, he offered a small handful of silver stags in exchange for produce, ensuring the presence of a fair market. In a realm so used to pillaging armies, such courtesy was almost foreign. The result was a wave of tentative relief. If these were truly the king in the north's men, perhaps the old times of Tully rule might return, times when the small folk weren't ground into dust by warring lords. By midday, the host reached a crossing point over the Red Fork. A series of stone arches bridged the slow-moving river, battered but intact. Scouts warned that Fry outriders had been spotted across the water. Robb gathered his captains for a brief consultation. It was decided that the army would deploy in a wide formation, prepared for a possible skirmish the moment they reached the opposite bank. Jon took command of the left flank, while Brynden Tully and the Great Jon led the right. Robb held the center, Vale Knights at his rear to reinforce where needed. The crossing proceeded in tense silence. Soldiers marched in disciplined ranks across the arches. Horses stamped nervously, picking their way over the worn stones. Sansa waited on the near bank with a guard of knights until the far side was deemed secure, then followed. All eyes swept the open fields, searching for the glint of steel that would herald an ambush. None came. The only watchers were scattered peasants. So far, no sign of Fry cavalry. A hush of relief traveled through the ranks. Still, Jon ordered outriders to fan out just in case. They established a camp 2 miles from Riverrun, well within sight of the fortress's towers. The castle rose proudly from its triangular perch at the meeting of the Red Fork and the Tumblestone, its massive walls reflecting the setting sun. Once the seat of House Tully, it was now the subject of heartbreak and tension. Even from a distance, Jon could see the Fry banners drooping over the ramparts, a crossing blue and gray, the twin towers that symbolized House Frey's seat at the Twins. The sight made his stomach churn. Nearby, Brynden Tully spat on the ground, fury etched into every line of his face. "That castle was my family's home for generations," he muttered. "I remember fishing off those walls as a boy, listening to my father's stories about the wars of old. Now it's infested by traitors." Robb said nothing for a time, only stared at the fortress with guarded eyes. Gray wind prowled around him, ears perked as if sensing the tension. At length, Robb spoke. "We'll offer them terms. They must release Edmure, recognize the rightful lordship of House Tully, and bend the knee to the king in the north. If they refuse, you know the threat," Sansa said softly, joining them. She wore a thick cloak, the wind catching at her hair. "They could harm Edmure in retaliation." Brendan's jaw tightened. "They might. But if we don't act, Edmure remains a captive indefinitely. We must be bold." That evening, a formal summons was drafted, sealed with the combined sigils of the dire wolf and the Tully trout. Robb's heralds rode under a white flag to Riverrun's gates. They returned an hour later, bruised and shaken, bearing a curt response. The Fry Castellan, a cousin named Ryman Fry, refused to meet with rebel scum. He demanded that Robb withdraw at once, or Edmure Tully would pay the price. Within the hour, another response came from the castle in the form of a grim display. An arrow soared over the walls, landing with a thud in the damp earth. Tied to the arrow's shaft was a small scrap of cloth bearing the Tully sigil, smeared with what looked like fresh blood. Sansa inhaled sharply at the sight. Brendan's face darkened. Robb's temper flared, but he held himself in check. "They want a siege," he said, voice low and furious. "They think we'll break if they threaten Edmure. Perhaps they want to provoke us into a rash assault." He glanced at the men forming up around the arrow's resting place, speculation churning in his eyes. "We can't let them slay Edmure. But we can't simply withdraw. Is there a third way?" Jon, who had been overseeing the left flank's entrenchments, approached in time to hear. He studied the arrow, the cloth, the smear of blood. "They might not have actually hurt him," he observed. "It could be intimidation, a trick. But we can't bank on that. We need a plan that corners them without forcing them to kill their hostage." Brynden let out a frustrated sigh. "A blockade might work. Riverrun has provisions, but not enough for a prolonged siege, especially if the harvest was poor. If we can starve them out, they might yield." Robb rubbed the bridge of his nose. "A siege is time-consuming. The Lannisters could intervene, or the Freys might find a way to sneak out with Edmure. Unless we ensure no one escapes." The Blackfish frowned. "We'd need to set watchers on every approach, bridges, sally ports, the water route. That means a complete encirclement." "Which we can do," Jon said slowly, "if the Riverlords join us. If we can rally them, we'll have enough manpower to surround Riverrun from every angle. Then we let the Freys stew. If they kill Edmure, they lose their only bargaining chip and guarantee their own demise. That might stay their hand. Robb's eyes glinted. Yes. We'll try to contact the nearby river lords. House Lannister, House Blackwood, House Bracken, House Vance, House Piper, any that remain. Brynden, you know them best. And Sansa can represent our mother's memory. If they recall Catelyn Tully with any fondness, they'll know that we come in her name. If we can muster their support, we can ring Riverrun in a force so large the Freys won't dare try and escape. That night, ravens were dispatched to every known keep and manor in the area. Brynden Tully composed each missive carefully, appealing to old loyalties. The war is not lost. The rightful Lord Edmure Tully is held captive. The king in the north stands with House Tully, and we need you. Some letters were more pointed, reminding the recipients that their oaths to House Tully had not been formally broken. There was still an obligation to come to their liege's aid. Others were gentle, merely inviting parley. It was a gamble. The Blackfish suspected that at least half of the river lords had bent the knee to the Freys under duress, or in exchange for keeping their holdings intact. Whether they would break those bonds now remained to be seen. Days passed with no immediate reply. The Northern Vale host dug in around Riverrun, establishing outposts along the roads, confining the Freys to the castle's walls. Fires burned in the night, and patrols scoured the countryside to ward off any attempt by the Freys to slip out under cover of darkness. Once or twice, an exchange of arrows took place, though no serious casualties were reported on either side. During this lull, Jon took up a watch on the perimeter one evening, walking along the newly dug trenches. The men stationed there greeted him respectfully, some Vale Knights, some Northmen, even a handful of Gendron's free riders who had pledged themselves to Robb. The night air was cool, laden with the scent of damp soil and distant wood smoke. Overhead, the moon was a faint sliver behind drifting clouds. He found himself pausing at a vantage point that overlooked Riverrun. Torches flickered atop the castle walls, the Frey banner a dark shape in the night. He wondered if Edmure Tully was locked in some tower room, aware of the host outside, praying for rescue. Jon's fists clenched unconsciously. He hated siege warfare, this slow tightening of a noose with a man's life hanging in the balance. Yet to assault those walls would invite a massacre or Edmure's immediate execution. A better solution had to exist if only time and alliances would provide it. Footsteps rustled behind him. Turning, he saw Sansa approach, wrapped in a thick gray cloak trimmed with white fur. She moved carefully through the muddy ground, a guard trailing a respectful distance behind. Jon offered her a slight bow of his head, and she smiled faintly in return, though her eyes were heavy with worry. "I couldn't sleep," she confessed. "The wind kept rattling the tent flaps, and I started thinking of all the things that could go wrong here." Jon nodded, gesturing for her to join him by the small brazier that glowed near the trenches. A siege frays everyone's nerves, especially with Edmure's fate in question. She tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, gazing at the distant silhouette of Riverrun. "I remember being a girl in Winterfell, hearing Mother speak of her home. She described Riverrun as a place of laughter and light, the seat of a proud and honorable family. It's heartbreaking to see it like this. And Edmure. I barely know my uncle, but I remember he was kind to me at my wedding to Tyrion. Even though I was frightened, he tried to offer comfort." Jon recalled hearing of that forced marriage, the Lannisters trying to bind Sansa to Tyrion. He'd met Tyrion once and did not hold ill will toward him personally, but the arrangement had been a different sort of cruelty for Sansa. A pang of sympathy flickered in Jon. "We'll do what we can to free him," he said. "I can't promise it'll be without risk, but Robb and the Blackfish will find a way." She nodded, resting a hand on the brazier's edge. "This is all so complicated. I'm trying to learn about negotiations, alliances, forging the right ties. I've been writing letters to the houses that once supported Mother. Some might remember me from King's Landing. If I can convince them we're not simply raiders from the north, perhaps that will help." "That's wise," Jon said. "You're good at dealing with courtesies and polite words." He hesitated, recalling his own awkwardness when it came to the subtleties of southern politics. "I'm better with a sword than with a pen." She gave him a fond look. "We need both. That's what Father always taught us. A lord should know how to wield a sword and a letter. And though you weren't raised as a lord, you carry his values." Jon felt a warmth in his chest at the praise, but he only nodded modestly. "Thank you. I do what I can. And if it helps standing watch and fighting, I'll keep doing it." They stood side by side for a few more moments, the quiet broken by the shuffle of soldiers passing on their rounds. Finally, Sansa turned to Jon and murmured, "I'll try to rest again." "Good night, Jon." He watched her go, cloak trailing over the muddy ground, her guard trailing behind. A swirl of memories tugged at him, of Sansa as a girl in Winterfell mocking Arya for her muddy skirts and yet radiant with hope for the future. So much had changed since those days. He exhaled, steeling himself for the long watch ahead, eyes turned once more to the stony towers of Riverrun. By the 6th day of the standoff, small groups began to arrive at Robb's encampment. They were lords or their envoys from across the Riverlands, Bracken men, Lannister riders, and even a modest contingent sporting the Raven banner of House Blackwood. Each group came with caution, some traveling openly, others under the cover of darkness. They sought an audience with Robb Stark, the Blackfish, or Lady Sansa, wanting to see for themselves if these calls to arms were genuine or some ruse. In the old days, they had sworn fealty to House Tully. Now they had to decide if this new Tully-Stark alliance was real and if it stood a chance against the Freys. Robb greeted them in the main pavilion, wearing his crown of bronze and iron with a simple confidence that contrasted sharply with the likes of King's Landing's pomp. Sansa sat to his right, Brynden Tully to his left, while Jon often stood behind them, offering silent vigilance. Each envoy brought stories of the ruin that had befallen the Riverlands, burned villages, forced tribute, the Freys' harsh rule from Riverrun. Some were eager to rise against the Freys, hungry to reclaim lost pride. Others were more guarded, worried about retribution if Robb should fail. They all inquired about Edmure Tully's well-being, exchanging uneasy glances when told that Edmure's life was threatened by the Castellan. As the days progressed, more lords trickled in. Some pledged swords outright, kneeling to Robb as king in the north and acknowledging Brynden Tully as the rightful caretaker of the Riverlands until Edmure could be freed. Others hedged, offering only moral support or small detachments of men, testing the waters to see whether the tide would truly turn. Still, the camp swelled with new banners, new tents. The ring around Riverrun grew tighter. Scouts reported that the Freys inside had attempted to send out a messenger by boat at night, but the watchers on the waterway intercepted it. The messenger was found with a letter appealing to the Lannisters for aid. Which means the Lannisters will learn soon enough that we are here, Robb said grimly when the captured letter was brought to him. They might rally at Harrenhal or send an army this way. We've no time to waste. Spurred on by this realization, Robb and Brynden began finalizing the blockade. Engineers from House Lannister arrived with materials for constructing additional river chains and watch platforms. House Blackwood contributed archers. House Bracken, ever at odds with the Blackwoods, brought horsemen. Amid the swirl of long-time rivalries, the king in the north demanded unity, reminding them that the Freys' treachery had injured all. Sansa played her part too, hosting small gatherings where she listened patiently to their grievances, offering gentle words that appealed to their memory of the Tully line. The Blackfish, for his part, used a combination of charm and threat to ensure that old feuds did not erupt into open fights within the camp. Jon oversaw the fortifications on the southern approach where the land curved around a bend in the Red Fork. On more than one occasion, Frey crossbowmen attempted to pick off the workers at dusk, leading to tense skirmishes. Jon took charge personally, ensuring that archers kept watch on the walls. Each morning, he rose before sunrise to walk the lines, checking that the barricades and sharpened stakes were properly placed. He spoke with the new Riverland recruits, forging a sense of solidarity. Though he was not a Stark in name, they recognized him as Ned Stark's blood, and that carried weight. Many of the older men recalled how Ned Stark had come south to aid King Robert during the Greyjoy Rebellion, forging respect that lingered still. In the second week of the siege, the Watchers reported the arrival of a significant force moving up from the south. Alarm rippled through the camp, Lannisters, perhaps, or Frey reinforcements from the twins. Tensions soared as horns signaled the approach. The Riverlands lords mustered their men, standing by to repel an incursion. Robb, flanked by the Blackfish, Jon, and a squadron of Vale Knights, rode out to intercept. When the dust of the advancing column cleared, it revealed the sigil of House Vance, accompanied by the Red Eagle of House Lannister. At the forefront rode Lord Norbert Vance, a thin, austere man with sharp features. Beside him was the formidable Jason Lannister, broad-shouldered and gray at the temples. They halted at a neutral clearing, their banners streaming. Robb approached with measured caution, though he recognized Lannister from the early days of the war when House Lannister had stood with the Tullys. The two men exchanged polite greetings. Lannister bowed his head, indicating respect for Robb's kingship. Lord Vance followed suit. "We have come," Jason Lannister declared in a firm voice, "to drive out the Frey usurpers and restore Riverrun to its rightful lord. This land has suffered enough. The Lannisters stand with you, king in the north." "We do so as well," Lord Vance added. Though we have lost much to the war, House Vance will not sit idle while the Freys squat in Riverrun. We bring 300 men. Relief and gratitude flickered across Robb's face. He extended his hand in greeting. Thank you. With your support, our blockade is nearly complete. The Freys cannot hold out long if enough lords unite. They returned to the camp, where Littlefinger and Vance knights pitched their tents. That evening, a great council convened under the largest pavilion, firelight dancing across the assembled lords' faces. Jon stood near the entrance, silent but watchful, as Robb presided. Sansa sat close by, her posture poised, her eyes sweeping across each face in turn. The Blackfish, arms folded, provided background and commentary on which houses had joined and which still hesitated. Jason Littlefinger spoke with bold certainty. Give me a fortnight and I can bring more men from Seaguard. We'll choke off any attempt by the Freys to flee along the Red Fork. Lord Vance nodded. We'll do the same from our side. With House Blackwood and House Bracken also present, we can ring the castle in steel. One of the lesser lords raised a concern. What if they kill Lord Edmure? We risk losing the last trueborn son of Hoster Tully. Bryndon's face darkened. I won't let that happen. Nor will any of you, if you have a drop of honor. That triggered a brief uproar of voices, some anxious about inciting the Freys' wrath, others determined to avenge the Red Wedding. Robb eventually raised his hand for silence. We will maintain the siege, offer terms again, and make it clear that harm to Lord Edmure will only worsen their fate. He paused, glancing at Jon. If it comes to it, we may need to mount a stealth effort. A small party might find a way into the castle under cover of night, rescue Edmure, and open the gates. But that would be a last resort. A hush followed, eyes turning to the black-haired man standing quietly by the pavilion's edge. It was known that Jon had a knack for slipping through formidable defenses. He'd survived beyond the wall, infiltrating wildling positions in the past. But such an operation was fraught with peril, and the mention of it seemed to underscore how desperate they might become if the Freys refused all parley. They concluded the council with a renewed sense of urgency. The lines around Riverrun would be tightened, watchtowers built, patrols increased. In the short term, they would send another formal offer of terms, accompanied by a clear warning. If Edmure was harmed, no fry within those walls would be spared. The Freys, if they had a scrap of self-preservation, might at least weigh the cost of defiance. That night, Jon found himself restless again. He wandered the perimeter, hearing the low murmur of men telling ghost stories or speaking of the next harvest. Somewhere, a soldier played a melancholy tune on a lute, the notes drifting over the flickering firelight. In the darkness, Jon thought of the wall of dire warnings from the far north, of white walkers that threatened more than these petty feuds. Yet here he was, helping to retake a single castle from Freys. It felt both necessary and woefully small compared to the cosmic threat lurking beyond the boundaries of the known world. But these were the steps that had to be taken, the wars that had to be resolved, if the realm was to unite against the greater danger. Close to midnight, a shout went up from the Western Watch. Jon rushed over to find one of the watchers pointing at a flicker of torchlight emerging from Riverrun's western barbican. A solitary figure, mounted, appeared in the gloom, approaching the moat that ringed that side of the fortress. At the edge of the moat, the rider paused, waving a white handkerchief. Through a spyglass, the watchers discerned that it was a woman, likely a messenger. Robb was summoned along with Brynden, Tully, and Sansa. They huddled near the trench, peering through the darkness. A voice carried from the walls, "Open the lines. We come under a flag of truce with a message for King Robb Stark." There was a tense debate among Robb's captains about whether to allow this messenger through. It might be a ruse, a spy, or an assassin. But Robb wanted to hear what they had to say, if only to gauge the Freys' next move. So a small gate was opened in the barricade, and a group of heavily armed men waited inside, crossbows trained. The rider crossed the open ground slowly, torch flickering. Within moments, they could see that it was indeed a woman wearing a dark cloak, her face partially hidden in its cowl. She dismounted, showing empty hands, though she carried a small leather satchel at her hip. Two Northmen seized her by the arms, searching for hidden weapons. Finding none, they marched her forward, flanked by a dozen guards, to where Robb and Brynden waited by the lamplight. Jon stood slightly behind them, one hand on the hilt of his sword. Sansa observed from the side, her expression tense. The woman lowered her hood, revealing a pale face with high cheekbones and fearful eyes. She introduced herself as Littlefinger Fry, a distant cousin of Lord Walder. She bowed awkwardly, then addressed Robb. "My lord, your grace," she stammered. "I come bearing terms from my cousin, Ryman Fry, Castellan of Riverrun. He asks for safe passage to treat with you directly." Bryndon's eyes narrowed. "We've already sent heralds for such talk, and your lot shot arrows at them. Why would we trust Ryman Fry now?" Littlefinger swallowed, glancing anxiously at the line of armed men. "He has reconsidered. The blockade has grown. Food stores are low and winter is coming. He's willing to discuss an exchange. Lord Edmure Tully for a safe withdrawal of the Fry garrison." Robb's expression remained cool, but a spark of hope flickered in his eyes. "He wants to abandon Riverrun and hand it back to the Tullys? In exchange for what? For free passage north or to the Twins?" She corrected herself. "He asks that you swear not to harm the Fry soldiers during the withdrawal. Lord Edmure will be released once they're a safe distance from here." Sansa's voice came out, clear but soft. "That's not acceptable. They could harm Edmure after they leave, or spirit him away to the Twins. We need a guarantee." Littlefinger drew a shaky breath, eyes flicking to Sansa. "Lady Stark, my cousin might be open to a direct swap at the gate. Edmure for the freedom to ride away unmolested. That's what he's prepared to negotiate." Brynden bristled. "And what is to stop them from slaughtering Edmure the moment they realize we're outnumbering them? We'd never—" Littlefinger began, but she trailed off, knowing it was a hollow reassurance. Robb glanced at Brynden, then at Jon. "We can't simply let them march away scot-free after all they've done. But Edmure's life comes first." He studied Littlefinger with an unreadable expression. "Does Ryman Fry truly have the authority to do this? Or is Walder Fry behind it?" She shook her head. "Lord Walder remains at the Twins. He is advanced in age. Ryman serves as Castellan here and believes the castle cannot hold out. I've told him as much, and the men grow restless." Jon exchanged a quick glance with the Blackfish. This might be the best chance to free Edmure without a bloody assault. Yet no one in camp truly trusted a phrase word. Robb steeled himself. "You will stay here tonight," he said to Littlefinger, "while I consult with my council. We will determine if we'll grant your cousin's request to treat. If so, we'll meet tomorrow under a flag of truce outside the walls. But mind this, if this is a trick, if any harm befalls Lord Edmure, your cousin will pay in blood." Littlefinger nodded mutely, shivering despite the mild autumn night. Guards escorted her away, ensuring she would not wander the camp. Robb called his advisors together. They debated long into the early hours, torn between suspicion and the need to rescue Edmure without further delay. If the Freys were desperate, that was a good sign. But their desperation made them dangerous as well. By dawn, a plan was formed. Robb would ride out with a contingent of knights, supported covertly by archers hidden along the perimeter. They would meet Ryman Fry on the open field near the riverbank. If Ryman truly intended to surrender the castle in exchange for safe passage, an immediate exchange of hostages would occur. Edmure Tully for some guarantee that the Fry soldiers could depart unharmed. The details were precarious. Jon would lead a hidden flank to circle behind the meeting ground, ensuring no Fry reinforcements could ambush Robb's party. The Blackfish insisted on being at Robb's side to see his nephew safe. Sansa would remain in camp, a precaution in case the Freys tried for a higher value hostage. That morning, the drums sounded as the sun peaked above the horizon. Under the watchful eyes of countless river lords and the Northmen who had marched so far, Robb Stark mounted his horse, wearing armor embossed with the direwolf. Grey Wind trotted beside him, a silent embodiment of northern power. Brynden Tully wore a mail hauberk, a Tully trout pinned over his shoulder. Jon, in turn, donned dark leather and mail, a helm at his saddle, ready to ride behind the lines with a contingent of mounted archers from the Vale. Littlefinger Fry was released from her guarded tent, her face drawn but resolute. She guided Robb's party to the designated meeting site, an open stretch of pasture halfway between the castle walls and the northern camp. There, a circle of churned earth surrounded a single tall oak, its leaves turning golden in the crisp air. Ryman Fry awaited them, accompanied by a dozen mounted men, banners drooping. They had Edmure Tully with them, chained at the wrists, appearing haggard and pale but very much alive. Jon watched from a distant ridge, scanning for any sign of reinforcements behind Ryman's position. None showed. His archers lay hidden among low stands of brush, arrows nocked. If Ryman tried anything, they would fire at Robb's command. The tension was palpable. Robb and Brynden advanced to the oak tree, halting within speaking distance. Edmure's eyes flickered with recognition upon seeing his uncle and king, relief mingled with trepidation. Ryman Fry, a heavy-set man with an unkempt beard, sneered. "You've come after all. Good. We can end this siege without more bloodshed. Unless you'd prefer to starve us out and risk your precious Tully's life." Robb kept his voice level. "I'm here to retrieve Lord Edmure, the rightful lord of Riverrun. You claim you wish to depart unharmed. Release Edmure and you'll have your safe passage." Ryman glanced at Brynden. "And the Blackfish come to see your nephew, no doubt." He nodded to two of his men who guided Edmure forward. "The chains rattled. We can unchain him right now, let him ride to you. But once he does, I expect your oath that we march free. No archers, no ambush. You can keep the castle. We want only to ride back to the twins." Brendan's lip curled. "That's it? You kill our kin at the Red Wedding, occupy our seat, and now you want to ride away without consequence." Ryman bristled. "Don't blame me for the Red Wedding. That was my father's plan, not mine. I only follow orders. But I've no stomach for a hopeless siege. We'll leave. And Edmure will live, which is more than can be said for some. Take it or leave it." Robb raised a hand, forestalling Brendan's retort. "Edmure first," he said. "Show me that you won't harm him." He nodded to the watchers on either side, who parted warily, leaving a small corridor of open ground between the two groups. With a grunt, Ryman dismounted, seized a ring of keys, and unlocked Edmure's chains. The Lord of Riverrun wobbled unsteadily, grimacing. Then he took a halting step forward. Brynden, all but trembling with suppressed anger, rode out a few paces, arms outstretched to catch his nephew. A hush fell across the field. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Suddenly, a flicker of movement. One of Ryman's men reached for a crossbow slung across his back, leveling it at Edmure's unprotected side. But in that same instant, an arrow whistled through the air from Jon's hidden archers and thudded into the crossbowman's chest. The man collapsed with a gurgle, the crossbow clattering harmlessly. Chaos erupted. Ryman Fry cursed, drawing his sword. Robb spurred his horse forward, gray wind snarling. Brynden urged Edmure to duck behind his horse. More arrows flew from the brush, striking down a pair of Fry riders who tried to pivot for an attack. Ryman bellowed, "Betrayal!" But Robb's voice rang out, furious. "You drew first. Surrender now or die." In that heartbeat, the Freys realized the scale of their predicament. Hidden archers had them in range, and Robb's knights stood ready. Several threw their weapons down. Others spun their horses in a desperate attempt to flee. Ryman Fry himself hesitated, eyes darting to Edmure, then to Robb, then to the arrow-riddled ground. Finally, with a snarl, he hurled his sword aside. "It was that fool's doing, not mine," he cried, pointing at the dead crossbowman. "I didn't order him to shoot." Brynden helped Edmure behind the lines, relief and rage shining in his eyes. The rightful lord of Riverrun was free, though battered. Meanwhile, Robb signaled to the watchers, ensuring no more violence was unleashed unless the Freys tried further treachery. One by one, the remaining Fry men disarmed, dropping swords, crossbows, or daggers into the mud. Jon emerged from his vantage point, riding down the slope with his archers. He crossed the field, scanning for any sign that more Fry reinforcements might pour out of Riverrun. None appeared. It seemed Ryman had come in earnest, but one of his subordinates had panicked, nearly killing Edmure in the process. The tension had exploded into a moment of swift violence contained only by Jon's hidden archers. Robb guided his horse to where Ryman stood, the man's face pale with fury and fear. Gray wind paced around them, muzzle curled in a soft growl. "You said you wanted safe passage," Robb said, voice shaking with anger. "Then your man drew a crossbow on Edmure Tully. Was that truly a mistake, or your intention?" Ryman shook his head frantically. "I swear, it wasn't my plan. His eyes flicked to the ring of archers, to the grim-faced knights approaching with shackles. "Let me speak with you privately, my king. I am no king of yours," Robb snapped. "You pledged nothing. You served House Frye, who slaughtered my men at the Twins and took Riverrun by force. You'll face judgment. As for your men, if they lay down arms and vow never to fight against House Tully again, I may let them live." Jon watched the trembling Ryman Frye, feeling a faint disgust. Here was a man who had inherited power through treachery and fear, now undone in a single moment. The archers had made it clear that the North had learned from the mistakes of the Red Wedding. This time, they were prepared for betrayal. Brynden Tully dismounted, clasping Edmure in an embrace. Tears glistened on the younger man's face. "Uncle, I feared I'd never see you again," he murmured. Then he looked to Robb. "Your Grace, you've saved my life. My father's castle," Robb gestured to the walls of Riverrun in the distance. "You were Lord Edmure Tully, rightful lord of these lands. Riverrun is yours again, once we secure it. The Freys within may surrender, or we will drive them out by force." He glanced at Ryman. "What is your garrison's stance? Will they surrender quietly, or must we storm the walls?" Ryman stammered, "They'll surrender. There's no point fighting. The men are hungry, frightened. Let me speak to them, order them to lay down arms." He eyed the ring of steel around him. "But I ask again, spare them. They only followed orders. You have Edmure back. Spare them if they kneel," Brynden said curtly. "Any who resist will be shown no mercy." That arrangement was finalized. Under heavy guard, Ryman Frye was marched to Riverrun's gates, flanked by Jon and a contingent of archers who stayed out of range of the walls. Ryman shouted up to his men, demanding they open the gates. After an agonizing pause, the drawbridge lowered. A tense standstill followed. The Frye soldiers in the courtyard, uncertain whether to fight or yield. Their castellan was flanked by Northern and Vale men, clearly a prisoner. The sight broke their spirit. In small groups, they dropped weapons and knelt. The gates were thrown wide, and the watchers outside let out a collective breath of relief. Jon led the first group of archers into the courtyard, ensuring no last-minute resistance. To his surprise, the halls of Riverrun were half deserted. Some had evidently deserted earlier, others died of illness, and a few slunk away in the night. This once proud fortress, battered by Frye occupation, stood silent and subdued. He oversaw the systematic disarming of the remaining soldiers, quietly reflecting on how close Edmure had come to death outside these very walls. Soon after, Robb Stark rode in with Edmure Tully and Brynden at his side. Sansa followed in a carriage not long after, accompanied by a strong guard. The courtyard filled with riverlords and Northmen alike, cheering as the Tully banners were unfurled once more atop the ramparts. Grey wind prowled among them, occasionally drawing uneasy looks, but the direwolf's presence felt like a guardian spirit. Atop the highest tower, the Frye banner was torn down. In its place, a massive Tully banner, the silver trout on red and blue, was hoisted up. It flapped defiantly in the autumn wind. A wave of emotion passed over the gathered crowd. There, amid the battered stones, Riverrun had returned to its rightful lord. Edmure Tully, though haggard, stood tall at the gate, tears running down his cheeks as he gazed upon the courtyard of his birthright. Sansa dismounted carefully, stepping onto the cobblestones. Edmure turned to her, voice choked with gratitude. "Lady Sansa, you've grown so much. Thank you for being here, for helping us take back our home." She inclined her head, her smile tinged with sadness. "You're my uncle, and this was my mother's home. I'm just glad we could return it to you." Nearby, Ryman Frye and his men were bound under guard. Some were allowed to leave under the strict condition of swearing never again to bear arms against House Tully or House Stark. Others, implicated in worse crimes, faced prison cells and certain justice in the days to come. Edmure, though still weak, insisted on walking the halls to see the damage done. The great hall was stripped of furnishings. The sept had been desecrated. The smell of neglect clung to every corridor. Servants emerged from hiding, trembling yet relieved to find Edmure returned. Jon and Robb conferred with the Blackfish about the castle's defenses, making sure it could hold in case the Lannisters responded. For now, they had a foothold in the Riverlands, a seat from which to negotiate or defend. Jason Mallister and other lords arrived, congratulating Edmure, reaffirming their fealty to House Tully. Sansa helped Edmure pen letters to neighboring keeps announcing the recapture of Riverrun, hoping to rally more support and put an end to Frye intimidation. That evening, a subdued but heartfelt feast was held in the Great Hall. Despite the lack of provisions, the new lord and his guests shared what little could be spared. Some of the recovered wine casks were opened and cups were filled with dark vintage. At the high table sat Edmure Tully, the Blackfish, Robb Stark, Sansa, and Jon, along with the principal riverlords who had aided them. All wore tired smiles. Shadows from the torchlight flickered across the walls, revealing the scars of Frey occupation. A hush settled over the hall as Robb stood to speak. He raised his cup, addressing the crowd with a measured, earnest voice. Years ago, House Tully sheltered me and my men when we marched south. My mother, Catelyn Tully, was born in this castle. My uncle Edmure sits beside me now, freed from captivity. Let this be a sign that the bonds between the North and the Riverlands remain unbroken despite all that has happened. I pledge to support House Tully's rightful claim, and in return, I ask the Riverlords to stand with me, not just for vengeance against the Freys, but for the realm's future. The Lannisters may come, or they may not, but we must be ready. Winter is coming, and with it dangers that go beyond petty feuds. He looked over the hall, catching Jon's eye. A faint nod passed between them, acknowledging the unspoken threat from beyond the wall. Few here truly comprehended the scope of that danger, but Robb intended to unify the realm if possible. Sansa, understanding her brother's meaning, offered a soft smile, heartened by his call for unity. Edmure rose next, leaning on the table for support, voice still weak. He thanked each lord present, name by name, praising their courage in coming to Riverrun's aid. He embraced the Blackfish, tears shining, vowing to restore the castle to its former glory. He spoke of a new dawn for the Riverlands, free from Frey tyranny. There were scattered cheers, subdued by exhaustion but genuine. The feast continued, men and women toasting the retaking of Riverrun. Sansa moved among the crowd, exchanging quiet words with riverlords, forging new bonds. Brynden Tully, though never a man of many pleasantries, managed a solemn toast with some old acquaintances. The great Jon roared about how this night called for more ale, relieved to be inside a proper fortress after weeks on campaign. Jon lingered at the edges, content to watch. He sipped wine sparingly, alert for trouble. A wave of satisfaction flickered in him. Edmure was free, and the Tully seat was in the hands of its rightful lord. Yet his mind drifted north. How long before the realm truly recognized the real threat beyond the wall? How many more battles would they have to fight before men set aside their quarrels to unite against the darkness? The next days were filled with the business of reconstruction. Riverrun's battered halls were cleared of debris, the gates and drawbridges repaired. The local small folk, hearing that Edmure Tully was restored, came cautiously to the castle gates. Some had scurried away when the Freys arrived, others had been forced to till fields under heavy taxes. Now they were welcomed back, and Edmure ordered that what little grain the castle had be shared with the most needy, promising a fresh start. Brynden Tully inspected the outer walls and found them in decent shape despite the Freys' negligence. Robb dispatched scouts up and down the roads, ensuring that no hidden pockets of Frey loyalists remained to harass travelers. One morning, as Jon made his customary rounds, he encountered Edmure Tully slowly climbing the spiral steps of the eastern tower. "Lord Edmure," Jon said, bowing slightly. "You should be resting." Edmure, breathing heavily, waved a hand. "I've rested enough. I need to see how badly they defiled my father's solar." He managed a rueful smile. "When I was locked in that cell, I swore I'd come up here first chance I got to remind myself that Riverrun was still mine." Jon walked with him. They reached the top, pushing open a heavy wooden door. Inside, they found a dust-shrouded chamber with tall windows that overlooked the castle courtyard. The furniture had been hacked apart or burned. Broken chairs lay strewn about. The remains of a tapestry drooped from a scorched wall. A hush stretched between them, the air thick with memories of better times. Edmure let out a shaky breath. "It was here that my father used to sit me on his knee, telling me stories of the War of the Nine Penny Kings. He'd scold me for daydreaming when he spoke of letters and ledgers. I hated it then, but I'd give anything to hear him one more time now." Jon glanced at the destruction, feeling sympathy for the man who had lost so much. "We'll rebuild," he said softly. "The tapestry can be replaced. The furniture mended. The important thing is that the Tullys are back in Riverrun." Edmure nodded slowly, looking out the window at the courtyard teeming with Northmen and Riverlanders working side by side. "Yes, thanks to you and Robb and my uncle. Without you, the Freys might have held this place indefinitely." A moment later, his voice dropped. Do you believe the Freys will retaliate from the twins? Or the Lannisters from the south? Jon exhaled. It's possible. Word of this will spread fast. But Robb and the Blackfish are preparing. If the Lannisters come, the Vale is with us now. The Riverlords are gathering. We're stronger than we were before. And what if the Lannisters offer a truce? Edmure asked, a hint of hope in his tone. Surely they must see how the tides have turned. Or perhaps they'd prefer not to engage, since King's Landing has its own troubles. Jon thought of the rumors swirling beyond these lands, that King Tommen was but a puppet of the Lannisters, or that the Tyrells held sway, or that Cersei Lannister's power was waning. It was all uncertain. If they offer truce, I suspect Robb will weigh it carefully. We have bigger threats to worry about. But if they choose war, we'll meet them. Edmure's gaze lingered on the sky where a flock of birds wheeled overhead. Then let the realm know that Riverrun stands and House Tully stands. No more whimpering captivity. After a pause, Jon offered a sympathetic nod, then left Edmure to his thoughts, stepping out onto the tower landing. The sunlight felt warm on his face, a rare reprieve from the bleakness of war. Below, in the courtyard, the daily tasks of rebuilding continued. The sound of hammers echoed as broken gates were reinforced. There was a pulse of life here, a renewed vigor that suggested the riverlands might yet heal. That afternoon, a raven arrived from the airy, bearing word that young Robert Arryn remained in delicate health, but the Vale's council functioned smoothly under the guidance of men like Yohn Royce and the Blackfish's trusted subcommanders. Another raven arrived from White Harbor in the north, describing renewed shipping routes and a hopeful note about potential shipments of grain if the harvest in the north had not been too severely impacted by the ravages of war. Little by little, the tapestry of alliances that Robb Stark had woven was coming together, a fragile but promising network of mutual support. In the days that followed, Robb decided it was time to send out feelers toward King's Landing to see if a larger peace could be brokered or if hostilities would continue. He penned a carefully worded letter addressed to the crowned King Tommen in name, asserting that the North had no quarrel if the Iron Throne recognized its independence and allowed the Riverlands the right to choose its own overlordship. Sansa, with her experience of the capital, helped refine the language, cautioning that the Lannisters might interpret even mild statements as provocation. The letter ended on a note that if the crown insisted on continuing the war, the North and its allies stood ready to defend themselves. Watching Robb seal that letter with the direwolf sigil, Jon felt a strange mix of hope and foreboding. Could the realm truly find peace? Or would old grudges and thirst for power drive them all to yet another battlefield? The uncertain future stretched before them like a winding path, overshadowed by threats both known and unknown. Yet for now, at least Riverrun stood free. Edmure Tully, rightful lord, reigned in his ancestral seat once more, thanks to the combined will of the North, the Riverlands, and the Vale. Sansa moved through the halls, an echo of her mother's grace, offering small acts of kindness that endeared her to the returning small folk. The Blackfish, tireless, took charge of reorganizing the garrison, ensuring the fortress would never again fall to treachery. Robb Stark sat in council, forging new ties, listening to lords who had once doubted him. And Jon Snow, walking the battlements, allowed himself a quiet moment to reflect on how far they had come since that tense morning at the Bloody Gate in the Vale. Each day, scouts ranged out to gather news from the roads. They reported that small enclaves of Frey loyalists had retreated north toward the Twins. The Riverlands were slowly rallying to Edmure's banner, though some remained too frightened to commit fully. A handful of outlaws still prowled, disorganized and desperate. But the noose of chaos was loosening, replaced by a slow, cautious order. The awareness of winter's approach, however, lingered like a distant thundercloud. The nights grew steadily colder, frost appearing in the mornings. Sansa suggested that the small folk prepare for the possibility of a harsh season. Edmure agreed, advising his stewards to stockpile grain, salted fish, and other stores in the castle's granaries. Meanwhile, Robb confided in Jon his growing concern that the White Walkers could not be ignored indefinitely. "We'll need more men for the wall," he whispered one evening in a private corridor. "Once we stabilize the Riverlands and ensure the Lannisters won't strike us in the back." Jon nodded. "Even then, I'm not sure if the houses of the South will believe us. They may see it as a northern myth. But I've seen them, Robb. They're real." Robb rested a hand on his brother's shoulder. "I believe you." and I'll do everything in my power to gather men to face that threat. Let's hope the realm unites in time. Time pressed on, a swirl of small events marking the daily life of a reclaimed fortress. Riverrun's gates opened to a trickle of refugees seeking safety, carrying what few possessions they could salvage. More lords arrived to bend the knee to Edmure, or at least pay respects. A sense of unity blossomed within the halls, fragile but growing. Then, one crisp morning, a rider appeared at the main gates wearing the livery of House Lannister. He bore a sealed letter addressed to Robb Stark, styling himself king in the north. Edmure and Brynden exchanged tense looks as the rider was admitted, escorted by half a dozen knights through the courtyard to the Great Hall. Robb, Sansa, Jon, and a scattering of riverlords gathered to receive him. The rider, a pale young man with trembling hands, bowed awkwardly and presented the letter. Robb broke the seal and read silently, his face betraying little. The watchers grew uneasy, the hush broken only by the crackle of torches. Sansa studied Robb's expression, searching for clues. Brynden stood at his nephew's side, arms folded. Finally, Robb looked up, handing the letter to Sansa so she could see the words for herself. "Well?" asked the Blackfish, impatience creeping into his tone. Robb's voice was measured. "The Lannisters propose a meeting under banner of truce at a neutral site 2 weeks hence. They wish to discuss an end to pointless hostilities." A ripple of surprise moved through the hall. Jon felt an immediate skepticism. The Lannisters were rarely so direct unless they saw advantage in it. Sansa read swiftly, lips pursed. "They acknowledge that the riverlands have endured enough strife," she murmured. "They refer to Tommen as the rightful king, and they suggest the North's rebellion has no cause to continue now that Joffrey is gone. They say they're willing to discuss regional autonomy." She frowned. "It's not a straightforward acceptance of independence, but it's a shift." Brynden's eyes narrowed. "Another wedding invitat. Ion, perhaps?" he remarked bitterly. A few near him gave grim chuckles, though the memory of the red wedding haunted everyone. "We can't trust them. Could be a trap." Sansa handed the letter back to Robb. "Or it might be genuine," she said. "The Lannisters face their own crises. If they think fighting us is too costly, perhaps they see reason. At least enough to talk." Robb exhaled. "We'll consider it carefully. I won't walk blindly into a lion's den. But if there's a chance to secure peace or a truce, we must explore it. The realm has bled enough." The messenger stood there, uncertain. "My lord, your grace. Am I to return with an answer?" Robb nodded. "Stay the night, refresh yourself. I'll have our reply prepared by sunrise. Until then, you'll be under guard." The messenger bowed, relief and fear mingling on his face. The guards escorted him away. A flurry of speculation erupted among the riverlords. Some insisted it was a cunning Lannister ploy. Others thought it might signal a genuine shift in power. Jon said nothing, recalling the cunning of Cersei Lannister and the rumors of her father's death. The dynamic in King's Landing was likely more fluid than the realm realized. Perhaps the Lannisters were desperate for a respite, focusing on some internal threat. Or perhaps they planned to lure Robb into an ambush. That night, in a smaller council, Robb gathered his closest advisors, Edmure, Brynden, Jon, Sansa, Jason Mallister, and a handful of other lords who had proven their loyalty. They debated the letter's significance for hours. Ultimately, they decided to accept the meeting in principle, but only under strict conditions. It would be held near Harrenhal in open ground, with equal numbers of men on each side, and no more than a set number of paces between them. Hostages would be exchanged as a guarantee of safety. Sansa insisted on adding details about who exactly would attend on the Lannister side. Would it be Kevan Lannister, or someone with enough authority to negotiate? Robb drafted the reply, carefully enumerating these terms, then sealed it. At dawn, the Lannister messenger departed, bearing House Tully's trout and House Stark's dire wolf and wax, an emblem of the new alliance. The man rode away under heavy guard until he was well clear of Riverrun's territory. Only then was he allowed to proceed on his own. So the stage was set for a tentative parley with the Lannisters, an event that might reshape the war's trajectory. In the meantime, life at Riverrun carried on, the autumn waning steadily. The nights grew colder, breath-puffing in the morning air. Craftsmen worked tirelessly to repair the castle's battered interior, rehanging tapestries and mending broken doors. Edmure's stewards inventoried the supplies for winter, rediscovering a few hidden caches of grain and salted meats that the Freys had overlooked. Sansa established a small corner of the library as her own, drafting letters, reviewing genealogies, and reacquainting herself with Tully family history. When Jon wasn't patrolling, he sometimes joined her, curious about old records that mentioned the North's alliances with the riverlands centuries past. They would sit at a long wooden table, candlelight flickering over dusty tomes. Sansa read aloud from a worn scroll. Here it mentions how King Torrhen Stark, the king who knelt, sought alliances with the Riverlords to stand against the Undul invasions. In those days, the Riverlands changed hands many times before the Tullys rose to prominence. Jon listened, frowning at the cyclical nature of war. Would these alliances always be tested by new invasions, new threats? At times, Robb joined them, seeking counsel on how best to approach the upcoming parley. He asked Sansa what she remembered of the Lannisters' courtly tactics, how Cersei or Tywin might have maneuvered. She recounted stories from King's Landing, cautioning him about the subtle manipulations that might arise. Jon offered reminders from the northern perspective. They must not appear weak, but nor could they dismiss the possibility of a genuine settlement. The tension in the castle was palpable as the days ticked by, each one bringing them closer to that meeting at Harrenhal. Scouts reported no major troop movements, though some rumored that a Lannister force might be gathering near the Blackwater Rush. Others speculated that the Tyrells were pressing King Tommen to focus on securing the Stormlands instead of tangling with the North. Many truths and half-truths swirled, adding to the uncertainty. Finally, the appointed day came. Robb and a chosen retinue departed Riverrun at dawn, riding southeast along the river road toward Harrenhal. Jon rode at his brother's flank, more anxious than he cared to admit. Sansa insisted on coming, certain her presence could help read the Lannisters' intentions, though Robb assigned her a heavy guard. Edmure, still regaining his strength, stayed behind to solidify Tully authority in Riverrun. The Blackfish, however, came along, refusing to let his king and niece face potential danger alone. They traveled swiftly, banners furled to avoid drawing unnecessary attention. The roads were in terrible shape, potholed and sometimes overgrown. The occasional farmstead they passed was deserted, crops shriveled in the fields. The weight of war pressed down on everything. Once at a fork in the road, they stumbled upon a small band of starving peasants. Robb gave them bread and told them to head for Riverrun, where Lord Edmure would protect them. The peasants fell to their knees in thanks, eyes brimming with desperation. Jon could only pray that no brigands lay in wait along the way. Their chosen meeting site, a flat expanse of ground north of Harrenhal, had been agreed upon in the final exchange of letters. The ruin of Harrenhal loomed in the distance. A massive, charred carcass of a castle built by King Harren the Black, its towering walls twisted by dragonfire centuries past. Rumor had it that the Lannisters held at least a portion of the stronghold. If the parley was truly sincere, they would emerge from Harrenhal's shadow at the appointed hour. Robb's men arrived a day early to scout the area, ensuring no hidden traps. They found the fields empty, grass bending in the autumn breeze. A shallow stream meandered nearby, the water glinting under a sky that threatened rain. The watchers set up a modest camp on a low rise, vantage enough to spot any approaching army. Nightfall brought a tension so thick Jon could almost taste it. He took the first watch, scanning the horizon for torches or dust clouds. All remained still, save the distant hooting of an owl. At dawn, the watch horns sounded. Riders approached from the south, a column perhaps 200 strong. The golden lion of House Lannister shimmered on their banners. Leading the way, Robb formed up his escort, equal in number as agreed. He, Jon, the Blackfish, and a select few advanced toward a midfield line where a single tall stake had been driven into the ground, marking neutral territory. Sansa waited with her guard at a safe distance, though she would approach once it was deemed secure. Jon's heart pounded with each hoofbeat, scanning the Lannister ranks. He recognized the crested helms of knights who had once fought against them at the Battle of Oxcross or the Whispering Wood. Near the front rode a man in richly ornamented armor. Kevan Lannister, Tywin's brother. Beside him was a younger knight with bright red-gold hair, bearing a serious expression. Maybe Lancel Lannister or another cousin. Behind them rode men in polished steel, silent and grim. Kevan Lannister dismounted first, planting his banner in the soft earth. Robb did the same. They stood face to face, neither man offering a smile. Kevan bowed stiffly, greeting Robb as Your Grace, with a note of politeness that seemed forced. Let us speak plainly, Robb said in a measured tone. I'm told you wish to negotiate a peace or a truce. We come in good faith, but we remember your house's past transgressions. Kevin inclined his head. I understand your caution. My nephew Tywin is gone, Joffrey is gone. The realm is weary of war. King Tommen desires stability. His voice was level, a hint of sorrow at the edges. We propose that the North be recognized as an autonomous region under its own rule, so long as you offer no threat to the crown. The same can be arranged for the riverlands, though the details must be decided. We want no further bloodshed. Jon listened intently, his gut churning with skepticism. The Lannisters offering such concessions seemed too good to be true. The Blackfish cleared his throat. What of the phrase? They remain your allies, do they not? House Frey murdered King Robb's retinue under guest right. Will you speak for them? Kevin's eyes flickered. We speak only for King Tommen and the Lannisters. If the Freys wish to continue hostilities, that is not our affair. We will not offer them aid in a fruitless war. Indeed, we have no love for the chaos they caused. That was a surprising admission. Brynden and Robb exchanged glances. Perhaps the Lannisters truly were fracturing from their old allies. Or perhaps it was another ruse. Robb pressed. And the terms for this autonomy? Do you claim taxes, soldiers, or is it true independence? Kevin hesitated. We can discuss. Perhaps a nominal tribute, or a symbolic recognition of King Tommen's overlordship. The details. A wave of discontent rippled among Robb's men. The old argument about whether to bend the knee to any southern king was heated. Jon studied Kevin's face. He seemed earnest or at least pragmatic. House Lannister might be reeling from internal struggles, trying to consolidate power around Tommen. If so, they could not afford another drawn-out war. This was their attempt to salvage the situation. Then Robb signaled to Sansa, who rode forward with a half-dozen knights. Kevin recognized her, bowing. Lady Sansa, I am grieved by what befell your family. I trust you found a measure of justice against Peter Baelish. Sansa's composure did not falter. Justice was served, she said quietly. Now we seek an end to unnecessary killing. My brother stands as king in the north. My uncle Edmure Tully stands as lord of Riverrun. The question is whether your king accepts these realities. Kevin replied carefully, King Tommen is prepared to acknowledge a wide measure of autonomy for the north and the riverlands. We do not desire fresh conflict. But the crown will never publicly endorse a separate kingdom, for that would undermine Tommen's legitimacy in the eyes of other regions. We ask only for a nominal fealty, no soldiers, no taxes beyond a token amount. Symbolic. Robb's jaw tightened. I was declared king in the north by my people. I cannot betray that. If your crown demands my subjugation, we have no accord. Kevin raised a placating hand. There may be other ways to phrase it. A pact of non-aggression. Perhaps the title of Lord Paramount of the North, a seat on the King's Council. These are negotiations, not demands. The conversation continued, tension woven into every exchange. They discussed trade routes, the policed border near the neck, the possibility of letting the Riverlands choose their own overlord. The Lannisters insisted that certain houses in the Riverlands might opt to remain sworn to the Iron Throne rather than to Edmure Tully, which rankled the Blackfish. Words flew back and forth, each side seeking advantage. Jon stood behind Robb, silent but watchful. He recalled how Tywin Lannister had once been unstoppable, orchestrating horrors like the Red Wedding through surrogates. Now Tywin was gone, and Kevin Lannister seemed far more moderate, even battered by the burdens of a realm in disarray. The meeting stretched through midday. Minor squabbles broke out among lesser lords, but Kevin kept a steady tone, emphasizing that King Tommen wished to avoid further war. By sunset, a tentative framework was hammered out. They would convene again in a fortnight at Riverrun to finalize the details if both sides agreed to the broad strokes. The Lannisters would not press claims on the north, leaving it effectively independent with only a vague gesture of fealty that amounted to nothing in practice. The Riverlands would be acknowledged as belonging to House Tully. The Tullys might owe some nominal courtesy to the crown, but the specifics would be determined. The main point was that the Lannisters would not send armies into the Riverlands or the north so long as the north recognized Tommen's seat as king in King's Landing without disputing it. It was an uneasy compromise. Not quite the absolute independence Robb once sought, nor a complete subjugation. But it might spare the realm another round of bloodshed. Jon could see relief warring with resentment on the faces of the northern lords. They wanted no part of the Iron Throne after all that had been done to House Stark, yet some recognized that a stable peace would let them return home, rebuild their shattered lands, and prepare for the winter that loomed. They departed the field with neither side fully satisfied, yet not wholly displeased. A certain guarded optimism hovered in the air. Kevan Lannister parted from Robb with a stiff bow, repeating that he would bring word to King Tommen. Both sides withdrew to their camps. That night, Jon lay awake, pondering whether these negotiations would hold or if a single shift in King's Landing could unravel everything. On the journey back to Riverrun, Robb's retinue rode more briskly, eager to deliver the news. Sansa conferred with him constantly, drafting a letter she intended to send to King's Landing, carefully worded so as not to yield too much ground while maintaining a cordial tone. The Blackfish grumbled about giving the Lannisters any courtesy, but he admitted that a stable peace might be the wisest course, especially with winter approaching. When they arrived at Riverrun, Edmure greeted them anxiously. He listened to their report, his expression shifting between cautious hope and lingering anger at the memory of his captivity. Ultimately, he accepted that if this arrangement was what it took to keep his people safe, so be it. The River Lords gathered, some balked at anything less than total revenge on the Freys and Lannisters, but Edmure and Brynden persuaded them that the region had endured enough bloodshed. In the weeks that followed, negotiations continued via Raven. Kevan Lannister wrote that King Tommen had agreed in principle, though certain formalities needed hashing out. Word spread that Margaery Tyrell's influence in the capital encouraged a more conciliatory stance toward the north. The Crown faced challenges in the Stormlands, in the Iron Islands, and in Dorne, where Mycella's fate was uncertain. A settlement with the North and Riverlands seemed expedient. For the first time in many moons, it seemed that Westeros might step back from the brink of perpetual war. Jon found himself in the courtyard one cold morning, watching snowflakes drift lazily from a gray sky. The first real snowfall of the season dusted the battlements, turning the red Tully banner white at the edges. It stirred a pang of memory in him, Winterfell's courtyard, the crisp air of the north, swirling flakes that muffled everything in stillness. Despite the uncertain peace, a sense of calm settled over Riverrun, a lull after years of turmoil. Sansa came up beside him, hugging her cloak against the chill. "Snow in the Riverlands," she murmured. "We must be close to true winter then." Jon inclined his head. "Aye. The realm won't be able to wage war easily in deep winter, even if the Lannisters wanted to. We might have a reprieve." She studied him, eyes gentle. "Does this satisfy you? Peace with the Lannisters under these terms?" He considered. "If it spares lives, perhaps. I worry about the threat beyond the wall. The longer we wait, the closer it comes. But at least with peace, maybe the realm can unite when the time is right." Sansa nodded. "Robb is determined to send men north to the wall once things are secured here. Edmure has promised to support that effort with supplies. We'll do what we can." A faint smile flickered across Jon's face. "That's all we can do, try. Maybe Father would be proud we chose peace over more slaughter. We've regained the Vale, freed Riverrun, rescued Edmure, toppled Baelish. Perhaps we've done enough to give the realm a chance." She placed a hand on his arm. "Father would be proud of you, Jon. We all are." They stood there as the snow drifted down, each flake a quiet promise of winter's inexorable approach. Beyond the walls, a realm battered by war began to stir with the possibility of renewal. House Stark and House Tully reclaimed their seats, forging new bonds with the Vale. Though old grudges simmered in many hearts, a fragile peace beckoned. And in that moment, amid the hush of snow and the looming hush of an uncertain dawn, Jon Snow, once a nameless bastard in the halls of Winterfell, allowed himself to believe that the realm might yet stand united when the final darkness fell. In the weeks and months to come, there would be more negotiations, more border disputes, more Frey machinations to unravel. The arrival of winter would complicate everything: travel, harvest, trade. Yet for now, the king in the north had established a stronghold in the Riverlands with the Vale at his back. Peter Baelish, the cunning spider, was gone, cast through the moon door. Sansa Stark, reconnected with her family, wielded diplomacy with a gentle but determined hand. Edmure Tully, once captive, walked the halls of Riverrun as its rightful lord. The tapestry of alliances wove itself into a protective shield against the chaos that threatened from every direction. And so their story continued, an echo of hope in a realm still haunted by the ghosts of war. They had taken the Vale with minimal bloodshed, dethroned Littlefinger through Vale law, freed Sansa, restored House Tully, and brought the Lannisters to the negotiating table. All of it hinged on the precarious balance of power that could shift at any moment. But for this season, at least, the children of House Stark had found a measure of justice, forging a path that might save Westeros from itself and from the chill horrors waiting beyond the far northern horizon.